Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Enhancements Working Group for Phase 2 at the California ISO. Today, we'll be covering enhancing BAA level market power mitigation, pivotal suppliers, and impact thresholds. Today's call will be covering a few housekeeping reminders, as this call is being recorded for informational and community purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. This meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. As well, we encourage comments, both verbal and chat, to be professional and respectful. We also encourage that if you can refrain from repeating any previously said comments, you can also provide that to our panelists through chat if you like to agree with anyone that has previously said, but we will try to manage effectively our time on our agenda that James will cover. To ask a question, please make sure you open the participant chat windows on the bottom right of your corner of your screen. If you're using the WebEx, you'll see that raise hand icon. You'll be added to our hand queue. Also, for those who are dialed in through the phone only, smartphone, also to telephone keypad, you'll press *3 to be dialed into the WebEx meeting. For any option that you submit comments, we encourage both name and affiliation before stating your comment. That would help us out. As well as you're welcome to add any questions to all attendees, all panelists and myself, and then our event producer today is Michelle, who will be helping assist us in today's call. I also added a few links on the chat that will be provided throughout the call, referencing any materials during the call, and also we'll be providing a Mentimeter opportunity to submit any informal questions to our team. That doesn't have to be answered at the time of this call. But at this time, the next slide I'll just cover quickly is just the policy and issue stakeholder process that we follow through our proposal development phase. At this time, we are currently within the pre-proposal development phase of working group status. So just give an overview for those folks who are joining us on the stakeholder process. And then now go ahead and introduce James. He'll be covering the agenda. And then we also have Danny Johnson, who's also there with us helping us out. We can see you, James. Just want to do a quick audio check before you get started.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Welcome everybody to our third working group meeting of the second phase of price formation enhancements. Today, our workshop agenda will focus on BAA level market power mitigation. So I will be covering 3 sections today. First, we will recap the previous working group meeting, go over some of the items that were discussed related to the grouping approach, and talk about some of the questions that were asked during that meeting. Second, we'll talk about a concept of mitigating only pivotal suppliers in the BA level NPM test. And third, we'll talk about potential implementation of an impact test and adding that to the CAISO's BA level mitigation process. So all of the discussion today are conceptual and intended to be both educational and drive some brainstorming for the working group to deliberate on whether or not the concepts discussed today would be beneficial or detrimental going forward with the BA level market power proposal. These are, again, intended to be conceptual and not ISO proposals. And there are also no ISO staff suggestions for what to do with these things, but just some ideas on ways to think about the trade-offs of these ideas. Last thing I'll note is that we are actively soliciting stakeholders to present at these working group meetings. There were no stakeholders that reached out for this particular meeting. The agenda, or the topics and the scheduled or TBD scheduled dates for each working group session is available on the Price Formation Enhancements Initiative webpage. If your organization is interested in preparing slides or just making prepared remarks and would like to be part of a future working group agenda, please reach out to Brenda or I, and we will help facilitate that for you. Let's move to the next slide, please. So this workshop has three major objectives. First, we're going to evaluate concepts for mitigating only pivotal suppliers rather than all suppliers in uncompetitive BAAs in the BAA level test. Second, we will consider implementation of an impact test component to the BAA level NPM framework. Third, we will discuss and compare different impact thresholds or different threshold approaches for impact testing and draw on some examples from other markets. Next slide, please. Here's where this discussion fits in with the overall BA level NPM discussion as laid out in the scope of the phase 2 of the PFE working group. This is the second discussion on BA level market power. The first was held on November 6th, in which we explored the grouping approach. There are also two planned sessions in March related to analysis. The first analysis will look at the CAISO balancing area structural competitiveness. And as part of that analysis, we'll lead into discussion about whether or not the CAISO BA should be included in the BA level test in the WEAM and EDAM. Later in March, we will discuss or have a mitigation frequency analysis in which CAISO staff will attempt to provide counterfactual analysis for, given the updated approach to the BA level market power mitigation, what is the change in mitigation frequency compared to the status quo. And a combination of those analyses should help the working group participants be better informed on what should go into the straw proposal that we're targeting for May. I will note that there are, for both scarcity pricing and market power mitigation, which is the track that we're discussing today, and also for VAPSTAR pricing, that there are 4 planned overflow sessions in April if there are additional topics that need to be discussed in more detail or are not part of the original scope. We'll have the opportunity to plan those sessions in April. And so there is the possibility that there may be topics in the BA level NPM that are not listed here that may take up those overflow sessions, and we'll communicate that as necessary. Again, if participants of the working group have feedback on the scope and timeline of the phase 2, please do reach out to us. And it's important that we capture as much as we can as we move into the May targeted straw proposal for these topics. Next slide, please. Okay, so first order of agenda is to recap the previous working group meeting that was held on November 6th with the topic of exploring the grouping approach for BA level market power mitigation. Let's go to the next slide. It's a very high level overview. The presentation materials are posted on our webpage. If the YouTube link is not up there yet, it is available on youtube.com. And we do try to post the YouTube link to the initiative page as soon as that's available. So if you don't see it on the initiative page yet, you can search for the California ISO on youtube.com, and the November 6th presentation and working group meeting is available to review on video. Here are the things that we discussed at a very high level on the November 6th meeting. The focus of that meeting was on a grouping approach to BA level market power mitigation, in which the market would test BAAs as groups rather than individually when they share the same marginal energy costs. So just a recap, marginal energy cost is the shadow price of the BAA's power balance constraint. And when there is congestion or some sort of scheduling limit that binds between balancing areas in the EIM or in the EDAM, the grouped BAs can become price separated from each other due to that congestion. And today, when those groups are price separated from the CAISO BAA and they have a higher marginal energy cost than the CAISO, those groups are evaluated for, or those BAs are evaluated for BA level market power mitigation. And the grouping concept is essentially to represent a shift from testing individual BAAs in that BA level assessment to evaluating BAs in groups that have similar price characteristics. So that's what bullet 2 basically says, that we would group BAAs together based on their direct transfer based on direct transfer connections and price levels. So if a BAA both has a transfer connection and has the same marginal energy cost, then they'll be put into a group together and evaluated as a group rather than individually. Just noting that direct transfer connection here does not imply that the BAAs need to be geographically contiguous. As long as there is a transfer connection established in the market through transmission rights or other ways, then it is possible for those groups to be evaluated together. Finally, we talked about the formation of the competitive LMP for BA level market power and how it would be set in the grouping approach. The idea proposed was that it would be set by the lowest marginal energy cost in the passing group that would apply to any BAAs that had previously failed, but then passed within the larger group. So some of the expected benefits of the BA level test or the grouping approach, first that it's potentially more accurate form of mitigation and assessment of the competitiveness of that local area by considering broader supply than just the suppliers within the balancing area itself. Second, we think it might reduce unnecessary mitigation in cases where a BAA may fail the test today as an individual BA, but when joined with a group may pass the test. And because it provides a more accurate assessment of competition among the group, it should reduce any unnecessary mitigation. Finally, we think that a grouping approach better reflects the actual market conditions and dynamics and is a better reflection than the status quo method of a now 22 balancing area EIM all across the West, and the methodology for assessing BA level market power should improve and expand as the market footprint has expanded. Next slide, please. So in the next few slides, we're going to talk about some of the major questions that were raised in the working group session, and some of them will be review. Some of them will be more elaborate responses than CAISO staff was able to give during the first working group session and have had a little more time to think about the answers. So one question came up relating to what happens when both BA level and local market power mitigation apply to the same resource. Would there be one or two competitive LMP reference prices? So just to be clear, the Western EIM and the EDAM have two forms of dynamic mitigation. One is local market power mitigation, which is evaluating the competitiveness of binding transmission constraints in the market footprint. And the second is BA level market power mitigation, which is what we're talking about today, where BA market power mitigation involves congestion between balancing areas that separate individual balancing areas from the rest of the market. And so because there are two forms of mitigation, it's possible that a resource located within a BAA who is considered uncompetitive from the BA level test may also have be mitigated for local market power mitigation if that resource is simultaneously providing counterflow supply to an uncompetitive transmission constraint within the BA boundary. And so the question became, well, if you have two different forms of mitigation, how does the competitive LMP work when you're potentially mitigated for both reasons? And the answer is that there's actually be a single competitive LMP that would apply that combines the elements of the BA level test and the local MPM test. So the competitive LMP would have both a BAA component, which uses the MEC of the next BAA group that passes the DCPA, which is essentially what we talked about in the previous working group session. And that would form the competitive marginal energy cost component to that BAA. But there'd also be a transmission component which subtracts the uncompetitive contributions from the transmission constraints based on those resource-specific shift factors. So you would have a competitive LMP that is formed based on the competitive marginal energy cost as deemed by the BA level test, but also the competitive LMP, local cost, as determined by removing the uncompetitive congestion contributions from the price. And the final competitive LMP would be the sum of all the competitive components. So to summarize, if you're a resource in the same BAA with no uncompetitive transmission constraints, the competitive LMP will be identical for all resources in that balancing area. Because there are no local transmission constraints, uncompetitive constraints, the same competitive LMP applies. But if there are uncompetitive transmission constraints in addition to an uncompetitive structural BA test, then each resource would get a unique competitive LMP threshold based on its specific shift factors that are combined in the way described above. Pause here for questions on this.
Let's go ahead and take Callie Wells. Michelle.
Hi, James. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. I just want to make sure I really understand how these two, the LMPM and the BA level market power mitigation, is essentially being combined to find a competitive LMP. So I guess my first question is, you note there that all resources in the same BA, if there's no uncompetitive transmission constraints, they're all going to have the same competitive LMP. But the third sub-bullet there says the competitive LMP is the sum of all competitive components. So if there's a BAA with competitive transmission constraints, will the competitive congestion components be added to the MEC?
In that case, no, because only the BA level MPM test would be binding in that case, and therefore the competitive LMP would be set based on the competitive marginal energy cost as deemed through the grouping approach.
Okay, so in that case, you're not going to also be doing the LMPM?
Well, if there are no uncompetitive transmission constraints, then there wouldn't be an LMPM test in that case. Or I guess you would have transmission constraints would trigger the LMPM test, and if the LMPM test didn't identify any uncompetitive transmission constraints. Actually, I think I hear what you're saying. Maybe I mistyped this third bullet to say that I believe that the competitive LMP would include the competitive components of the competitive components of the local congestion, and it would use the competitive marginal energy cost as deemed by the BA level test. So I guess then okay. In that case, this first sentence of the last section is not accurate.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. So on that note, if the competitive LMP used, the final competitive LMP used is the competitive MEC plus all the competitive congestion components, can't you get into a situation where a resource has a competitive LMP that's lower than the competitive MEC because you're pancaking these two? So for example, if the competitive MEC is 15 and a resource has, there's no uncompetitive transmission constraints, but it has a -10 competitive congestion component, that resource's specific competitive LMP will now only be 5, even though the competitive MEC was 15. Am I understanding that right?
So I guess, yes, I guess in that case, that would be true. I'd have to think about, I'd have to double check in this case, when the BA level test is the only form of mitigation. I guess what I need to clarify for the working group is this sentence here, that when the BA level test is binding, is the competitive LMP that's defined at each location, inclusive of the competitive component. So you'd have a locational specific competitive LMP, or is it just the competitive marginal energy cost that's used?
Yeah,
so
that would be great.
Yeah, I see why that's confusing, and I have to make sure that is clarified.
Yeah, because I think if you pancake the two, you're going to end up with a competitive LMP that's lower than each of the individual competitive LMPs, as determined by the test, the formulations today, which we've been struggling with a little bit to understand. So if you can get that clarification, that would be great. Thanks.
Okay, I appreciate the question, and sorry, I didn't have a firm answer for that, but we'll make sure that gets communicated properly.
No worries. Thank you.
All right, any other questions or feedback on this slide?
No more questions. Oh, James, we just got one hand raised from Kathleen Colbert.
Great, thanks, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I have a more general question, but it seems like a good point to ask it unless you want to talk about it maybe after. You just let me know, okay?
Sure.
Part of what I wanted to get a sense of today was just how firm the CAISO is on your proposals, and like this element's a good example. So like, are you thinking that, just for the sake of hypothesis, that like this is 99% what you're going to do when you're looking for like 1% of clarifying questions like Callie just posed to kind of help tease out a little bit more clearly your intent? Or are you putting this forward as, let's say, more of like a 35% firm, but you're looking for collaboration and kind of delving into the high level like policy intent of what is a competitive price for a resource, and then kind of working through that as a group? I'm just trying to get like a process sense. I appreciate you, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. If by this you're referring to this specific slide, this description is the status quo. So there is no proposal or change here. I'm just trying to describe under the status quo. If the
BAA level competitive yet.
There is BA. We have BA level mitigation in the EIM and proposed for the EDAM. And there are BA level competitive LMPs that are calculated. And what I'm struggling to articulate is, in the cases where you have a balancing area that fails the BA level test, and also there are local areas within the BA that fail the local market power test, how do you combine essentially there's going to be one competitive LMP for all locations.
Correct.
And the process for calculating the competitive LMP in the case where the BA level test is deemed uncompetitive will include changes to the marginal energy cost component that would apply in the local market power test of calculating the competitive LMP. And there's a missing link that Callie described that I have to help put together.
Yeah, I think there's more than one missing link. So I was trying to figure out the kind of feedback you're looking for. So yes, I understand that you're mitigating the EIMs that way, but you're not CAISO. So it's less familiar to me how you're mitigating in that region. I will be honest, I was not aware that you were doing a different competitive LMP calculation though. I did know that you were identifying when the constraints were binding and then mitigating all of the resources within a WEIM BAA. I did not know you were calculating a different competitive LMP. So that might be one other like statement that you're assuming is clear, but it's not. I don't think it wasn't to me at least. Can you confirm that one more time? You are in fact calculating a different competitive LMP for the WEIM BAAs than you are for like the KISO resource node?
Yeah. Yes, in this case we are, because the KISO BAA is not subject to the BA level test. And
That's
so
right.
the calculation of a competitive LMP for the rest of the Western EIM will be different, because what constitutes competitive in that case involves both the competitive marginal energy cost in this case, that can be determined. In this case, the thing that's additional to the status quo here is the calculation of the competitive marginal energy cost is determined through the grouping approach. But under the status quo, the competitive marginal energy cost is just assumed to be the KISO's MEC.
Yeah,
And so that
and
would be the one additional part of that.
one other clarification. So that's really helpful. If you could help be crisper on the fact that this, what you're describing is status quo for the WEIM, I think that's helpful to also bridge that link. The other thing I'd note though is I heard you say that the competitive LMP is the same across all resources. The competitive LMP, I mean, that's not my understanding. The competitive LMP should vary based on a resource node's effectiveness to the non-competitive constraints that are, so the non-competitive constraints are identified and they're removed from the resource test in the competitive LMP. So depending on your effectiveness to those constraints, I think the competitive LMP is different at different nodes, but it'd be good to get that clarified.
Yeah, I can confirm that that's true. I can confirm that that's true. The competitive LMP is different for every location. The confusion came.
Clarifying.
Yeah, I did, and the confusion comes in this sentence here where I think I have some unfortunate word choices where I say for resources in the same BA with no uncompetitive constraints, the competitive LMP threshold will be identical, but that is not true. What I had meant to say is that the marginal energy component of the competitive marginal energy component that helps informing the competitive LMP is the same. I saw George with his hand up, and he might want to help me unwind the mess I made with that sentence.
This has been helpful for me, but I'm happy to hear George's additionals. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Can you hear me well?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is a feature that we have in our market power mitigation since even before EIM, right? When we had the LMPM feature, if you have multiple constraints that are binding in the MPM pass, DCPA is performed on each one separately. So we assess the competitiveness of each constraint, each binding constraint based on the RSI3 methodology, of course. And you can classify these constraints as competitive or uncompetitive. Now, each of these constraints has a contribution to the marginal congestion component of the LMP for any specific resource. And these contributions are different, obviously, because there are different shift factors that these resources have to these constraints. So when you piece together now what we call the competitive LMP, which I prefer to call it competitive LMP threshold for more clarity, you go to the LMP at that specific resource and you separate all the competitive and uncompetitive components. And the sum or the net of all the competitive components give you the competitive LMP threshold that you use in the mitigation of the energy bid if that resource meets the requirements and the conditions for mitigating, which are, by the way, looking at the net uncompetitive component. If it's positive, then you proceed to mitigate, and you only mitigate above the threshold. So that threshold is really resource specific because of that effect that its resource has a different impact on the constraints, so it gets different contributions to the marginal component. Now, when we introduce the BAA level mitigation with EIM, just like any transmission constraint that is binding, you also have now the power balance constraint that is binding. And in this analysis here, we may be doing a group test in EIM. Currently, we do a BAA test for each BAA that meets certain conditions. But it doesn't matter. At the end, you have an assessment of whether that BAA is competitive or uncompetitive. Today in EIM, we take the ISO being a competitive BAA, so any marginal energy component, if we were using this instead of the SMAC, that is higher than the ISO MEC, we split it into two parts, the competitive part, which is the ISO MEC, and any additional part, which today shows as congestion, and we say this is uncompetitive. We put it along with the uncompetitive component. Here we're doing exactly the same thing. We have an MEC for each BAA, and we determine through this methodology that we discussed in the previous group session, we determine whether it's uncompetitive, and then we find out the competitive threshold for that MEC, looking at the next lower group that passes the test. And therefore, that MEC for that BAA has also two components now. The competitive portion, which comes from the MEC of the next group, and then anything additional, which now becomes an uncompetitive portion. So same as before, we group all the competitive and uncompetitive components. All the net of the competitive components is your threshold now for that specific location. And then the uncompetitive components net to a value that if it's positive, we will proceed through mitigation, and we mitigate the bid above that threshold. So in general, that LMP threshold, we call competitive LMP, is resource specific. If you ignore or you say there are no uncompetitive transmission constraints in LMPM, then you may only have one uncompetitive component, which is the difference between the MEC of the BAA that failed the test and the MEC of the next group that's considered competitive. And the competitive threshold is now everything else. So we also consider marginal loss and marginal greenhouse gas, if that's relevant for locations within a greenhouse gas regulation area, competitive. So just because of the marginal loss component, which is also different by location, you may have a slight difference in what is the competitive threshold, even in this edge case for the BAA, because all the other components, the MEC, the marginal greenhouse gas component, if the BAA is entirely inside the greenhouse gas regulation area, they're the same, but the marginal loss can be different. And even the greenhouse gas cost can be different if the BAA slices a greenhouse gas regulation area, it's not fully enclosed. So in general, we should think that the threshold is resource specific. And the mitigation criteria are also resource specific because we have to sum up all the uncompetitive components and see if we have a positive net. It is theoretically possible that the BAA is uncompetitive, so you have an uncompetitive MEC component, but then this resource may be contributing to congestion on transmission constraints that are also binding and uncompetitive, which, you know, they have a negative contribution to the marginal congestion component, and the net is negative. We won't mitigate this resource, even though other resources in the BAA are mitigated because the BAA failed the competitive test. So all of these are possibilities. Even the one that Kali was suggesting, that what happens if we net the components and we find a net negative? So is it possible that we can have a competitive MEC that is positive, but then a competitive marginal congestion cost that is negative, and the net is negative. Yes, it's theoretically possible. It can happen. And then you have essentially a negative LMP threshold, but that doesn't affect really, it affects the mitigation because you mitigate above that threshold. And if that threshold is negative, essentially you may be mitigating the entire energy bid at that location. But the resulting bid that you have is the lower of the DEB or the submitted bid. So even if the threshold is negative, that doesn't mean we end up with negative bids. The bid is still positive if the DEB is positive. It's just the threshold above which we mitigate. So I hope all of this was helpful to get an anchor on how the existing mitigation works and how it is simply expanded to this initiative without really changing the methodology. We're just simply expanding the concepts. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful, George. Thank you. It was helpful in reminding me of all of my years doing design of LMPM as well. Thank you. So that leads me back. I think, James, just my question. I'm really just trying to get a sense of, so you've brought something into this initiative as a scope item. That's awesome. So now we have an opportunity as a stakeholder group to actually discuss the policy around this. I have assets in California. Respectfully, the idea of how you were adding a BA component and using that in other areas, I'm going to be very transparent, was a low priority for me to engage in. Now that you're bringing into a policy initiative, the scope item of expanding a BA mitigation to the CAISO BAA, it's really important that I understand what that looks like and how it would be done as a threshold level. But the second thing is, in a normal policy initiative, I assume we're designing something and we can talk about it. We talk about the pros and cons, and we can work towards finding like the best approach, not just this is the status quo and we're extending it. So my original question of the way I heard that last sentence was, this is 99% firm. We are extending it. Please submit comments and we will see you later. Versus this is 35%. You're saying, hey, we want to extend this concept of BAA to CAISO. Let's talk through how we do that. I just really need direction on where you are.
I would say that it's a blue sky approach, that we are completely open to any and all suggestions. If the working group wants to completely tear down the status quo, then that's up for discussion. The only reason, the reason why this kind of information is important is simply because for someone to understand, you know, it's important for someone to be able to understand how the status quo works in order to understand how the status quo can be improved. And so nothing on this page is a policy or a proposal. It's just a description of how it works so people can provide feedback about what can be improved.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I think the clarification on, and I think honestly where I'm getting hung up a little bit is this is not the status quo in CAISO, right? The status quo in CAISO doesn't have a BA component. And so I think I'm just getting hung up there. But no, thank you for the clarity. It sounds like you are looking for comments on whether or not, as a working group, we want to start from ground up, or if we want to move this forward, leveraging the status quo. Like that's the level of comments you're looking for. Yeah,
that sounds right. And cool. I will add that there will be more time and space to discuss the specific question about how the CAISO BA is treated within the overall process, and the methodology of the grouping approach is independent of that, or it can be independent of that, the answer to that question, because as demonstrated on the 6th, the grouping approach can apply whether or not you continue with the CAISO BA within the test or not. And they make small differences in assumptions in the test, but it's robust to that. So I hope that helps too. Okay, so I will, I hope people have been able to learn from my mistake, and I apologize for the poorly worded slide. And when we post these slides, I'll make sure to have corrected the language that's not quite correct here, but hopefully by undoing the mistakes people have, it helps some people learn along the way. But I just want to summarize this question to say the answer is that there is only one competitive LMP at each location. There's not a separate or third reference price that's used along with the DEB that applies at both the BA level and the local NPM tests apply. So that was essentially what I was trying to say. Next slide, please. Okay, there were questions raised in the last working group meetings about why transfers are considered competitive supply. And this was discussed during, the answer was discussed during the working group, but just to recap, transfers are considered competitive supply because there's assumed to be sufficient competition from multiple suppliers at interties. And so we talked about that quite a bit in the last working group. Next slide, please. Oh, let's pause for a question, sorry.
Hi, this is JK Wang from PG&E. James, my apologies that you explained in the last meeting already. I just want to clarify here. When we say transfers are considered competitive, that includes both the case when the line of the transfer is congested and it's not congested. Is that right?
So in this case, the word transfer in this case is talking about transfers that are coming in or out of the BAA, in and out of the group itself, but not between the groups. So in the grouping approach.
Okay.
Yeah,
so it's not a transfer between BAAs, but a transfers between the groups.
Right. So it's not a transfer between BAAs within the same group.
Okay.
But it may be transfers from outside of the group into the BAA, or vice versa, a transfer from in the group out of the group.
Oh, okay. I think I'm a little lost now. Sorry. Let me elaborate what you just said. So for the transfers outside of the group, it's always competitive, but within the group, it's not always competitive, or I said it opposite. It's transfers within the group is always competitive.
Import transfers from outside of the group are considered competitive. But in the case of the BA grouping, there are going to be, as like in the examples that we had last time, there are going to be unconstrained transfers between BAs that are within one group that we're testing. And in that case, the transfer quantity is sort of, what you're looking at is all of the suppliers within that group and the aggregate demand of that group, and not really looking at the transfer. So in this context, when we're talking about transfers being considered competitive supply, this is more so reference to import transfers that are coming in from somewhere outside of the group.
Gotcha.
And yeah, so that import transfer is considered a fringe competitive supply for the context of helping a balancing area that's being tested to meet its power balance constraint in that case.
Gotcha. That's really helpful. Can you also please confirm that we will continue the concept or definition of the transfer in the following discussions as well?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's go to the next slide. This question got raised in response to the example on slide 23 of the previous working group material, in which there were two balancing areas, and the example demonstrated how testing two BAAs separately could cause one of the BAs to fail the test, but when you combine the BAs into a single group, the BAs pass. And there was questions about why should the transfer capability limitations between the groups impact the resource supply or residual supply index. Our take on that is that no, it doesn't need to be considered for the following reasons. First, if the limit is somehow relevant to market power, meaning that some supplier within a balancing area was trying to exert market power, and therefore you're siphoning supply from some other balancing area into your BA, and that constraint binds, then that creates price separation between the two groups, and those BAs would no longer be grouped together. So if a supplier really was trying to exercise market power in that balancing area, then it would, in the transfer constraint were to become a factor, it would bind and they would be separated and they would not be evaluated together. And to the extent that there is not price separation between the two, then the transfer limit is not a constraint on the competitive supply in any way that enables market power. And so in the case of the example on slide 23 of the previous, there was not a stated transfer limit between the two balancing areas in that example. And it is, our perspective that even if there was a transfer limit that was above the transfer quantity that cleared in the MPM pass, that it's not necessary to consider that transfer limit in terms of using it in the residual supply index for purposes of determining whether the group is competitive or not. We'll pause for a question.
Hi, James. This is JK Wang from PG&E again. I have a question, and you can let me know whether it is related to this question or we'll discuss later. So for price separation to determine group and not including the transfer limit in the consideration, I wonder if there are actually cases when two BAAs have the same price, but they are not connected. So they're topologically separated, but they have the same price, BA level.
Yeah, I've wondered the same thing, and I see George's hand up. I speculate that can happen, but it would be rare. George, do you have any insight to that question?
Yes, this is theoretically possible if the bids are exactly the same, and it so happens that the same level bid clears to be marginal in each of these BAAs that are not directly connected. It's, of course, a mathematical impossibility for this to happen in practice because we have marginal loss contributions and different congestion that may have different effects from resources that even have the same bid. So although it's a theoretical possibility, it's not really practical. I don't expect that we will ever see that. That will be like, something incredible that happens. So I wouldn't worry about it. And to answer the previous question, that I know there is a little bit of concern, what happens with the transfer? It didn't bind in the market power mitigation pass, and we consider it, competitive, of course, but there was a question and some discussion with Alva, I believe, last time that pointed out that, that there is a limited transfer capability that exists here. So if you're not considering the scheduling limit for the transfer within a group, and you say, okay, let's evaluate the group as a group, trying to find out all the supply meeting the demand, that may be a little bit inconsistent. And I just want to point out that this is not a new argument. This is the same argument that one can make for LMPM today between the MPM pass and the IFM pass. So we only test for competitiveness binding constraints in the MPM pass, but then when we solve the IFM pass, the problem is a little different because we have different bids, so different things can happen. So it's very possible, and we have seen it happening, that a constraint is not binding in the MPM pass, so obviously we didn't test it, and it's binding in the IFM pass, and we say, okay, we can see that. We say, okay, this constraint is binding in IFM, and we didn't test it because it was not binding in MPM. What do we do now? We don't have the time, of course, to go back and say, well, let us this constraint now, repeat NPM. From that point on, with the new bids, maybe we need additional mitigation. So obviously we can't afford to do that. So what we do is we live with it, and these are, the odd cases. Even the LMPM is not 100% perfect, right? There is some imperfection. So we try to do the best that we can based on the NPM solution. So by extending this concept and this philosophy, if a transfer is not binding and cause price separation in the NPM pass, when we test the group, we just ignore the transfer. We say, okay, there's competitive supply that can be transferred across these PAs within the same group. So I just wanted to provide the answer to that question, because I know it's appears problematic to some people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. I think that's very well explained. I'm already convinced. I will confirm with Alva as well. I think, this, as you mentioned, is not a new problem, as after the mitigation, the actual bids will change, so we cannot really do the predictive mitigation, and there will be compromise if you actually incorporate a margin into that. Yeah, thank you for the insights. And for the answer that you provided to my first question, as can I interpret it as you never say the case in practice that the two BAs share the same price but not interconnected?
I can't say that I haven't seen it because I haven't been actively looking at it. I don't think. I mean, we have to ask this question to more people, but I find it extremely unlikely that, particularly because we entertain bids with a precision of 0.01 megawatts. And even if two bid segments at different resources across PAAs, they have the same exactly bid price down to that precision level, everything else that factors into the solution, including losses and congestion and everything else, it makes it virtually impossible to have the same resource being marginal and setting exactly the same MEC for two BAAs that are just not connected. I don't think we need to really worry about that. This is like about worrying about a celestial body hitting Earth or something like that.
All right. Yeah, I like the optimistic view. Thank you.
Hey, James.
Go, Kathleen.
Thank you. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Question. So transfer constraints are included in the DCPA today, right? So this is not status quo. This is a question.
They're included indirectly. Technically, the way that the DCPA process in the EIM identifies price separation is through the power balance constraint and not looking at directly the transfer constraints and whether they're binding.
The individual BAA power balance constraint, is that right? That's my memory. Okay.
Yeah, although it obviously implies somewhere on a path that there's a constraint on a path somewhere that is limiting the supply of imports into some BA, and then it comes price separated.
Yeah, I will share with you that your BPM does say that you do not include interties between BAs, but you do include sets of interties, combinations of interties that represent a WEIM transfer constraint. And it does talk about the power balance constraint. So I wanted to confirm that might be useful to confirm later on too, because it does say that they include them. So I'd appreciate that. Just double checking that one more time. With that said, can I, at just like the highest level, I wanted to share that I really still struggle with this. So I think more conversation is definitely needed. I'm not disagreeing with the premise at this point. I'm not disagreeing with your premise, but here's what I'm struggling with, is that local market power mitigation which builds off of a 3 pivotal supplier approach, but we have a more unique one that has an impact test of the resource location. Like, this is testing to see whether that there are non-competitive constraints within a system, right? And we test those. We look to see if there is, if it's competitive, there's enough residual supply to address the demand for counterflow. It is hard to know that that is what so we have a decision and a policy that we believe we have versus local market power, and so we do this test. And then to turn around and say, but we're not going to test a set of transfer constraints, and I'm just going to use transfer loosely, internal and between BAAs that are considered a WEIM transfer constraint. We're not going to test some of them because you're doing a different test. I need a policy explanation, not an implementation one, right? I need something that I can sink my teeth into to understand the policy behind why transfer constraints, identifying whether or not there's a demand for counterflow and whether there's supply to address that, are different enough from internal constraints that you do not think the dynamic competitive, like you do not think that local market power mitigation, that there's any risk of it, right? Because that's what if you don't test the constraint and it's RSI, then you're saying there's no risk of local market power being exercised. And I just need to have some analysis or basis to get where you are.
I understand the question, but I admit it goes beyond my expertise in terms of how the power flow accommodates transfer locations. I know that transfer constraints are indirectly evaluated through the BA level process that is using price separation as the trigger. But in terms of like and this actually came up in the phase 1 working group where the dynamic competitive path assessment for a transfer constraint is a little misleading because we're not actually evaluating flow, you know, a path.
No, you're not.
Yeah, so to the extent that it could. Yeah.
Right, you could.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about this from a policy perspective, this is what I'm struggling with, is I think the question is, should you be evaluating demand for counterflow and the availability of supply to relieve that on these paths? And the answer comes from whether or not there's a risk of local market power. And so I don't expect you to know the answer today, but this is an ask for us to talk about in one of the future sessions, and to ask the CAISO to take this back and ask yourself that question. Is there a risk of local market power or not as a result of these transfer paths? And if you could bring back your view from that lens, that will help, I think, myself for sure, and I hope some other stakeholders. I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, and I see George with his hand up. I do know that, you know, for all resources are effective, all resources within a balancing area can effectively provide counterflow to the transfer limit through the power balance constraint. Maybe George can explain a little bit more about what's going on behind the curtain there.
Yes, and this is similar to the discussion we had last time on why do we consider import bids competitive. But this is specific for the transfer. So the reason is that when you have an import transfer to a BAA or to a group of BAAs, what contributes to that transfer is all external resources, not only the resources from the BAA that is the source for that transfer, but even resources further out in other BAAs that are interconnected with that BAA. So basically the entire world outside of that group is really competing for that transfer. That's the maximum level of competition you can ever hope for. So that's why we consider import transfers into a group competitive. And we consider them fringe competitive supply in the analysis. So it's not dissimilar from the previous discussion we had on import bids. Why imports for the California SOBA that are also bids? why they're considered fringe competitive suppliers, because you have all this potential supply from scheduling coordinators that are competing through the intertie scheduling limit, and that's what makes the supply SC agnostic, as was in the previous slide. Essentially, you have maximum or potentially very high level of competition, and that's why we consider all these imports as fringe competitive supply. The same goes with the transfers. Thank you.
James, you're on mute.
Yep, let's go to the next question.
JK, do you have a question? You're unmuted.
Yes, I do. Just have a quick follow-up question on Kathleen's question. James, please let me know I'm asking something ahead of time. I want to clarify for the local market power mitigation and the BA level market power mitigation, do they happen simultaneously? Like, is there a sequence? Which one happens first currently?
I believe that they occur simultaneously.
Okay, thank you. That's all I want to ask.
All right, thank you. All right, let's go to the next slide. There was a question raised in the previous working group about when a BA is marked uncompetitive, can suppliers outside the BA boundary be considered pivotal and mitigated? So under BA level market power mitigation, the answer is no. That imports from outside the BA group count as competitive supply, as we've talked about, and that can be transfers or net imports from outside the market footprint as a whole. When it comes down to local market power mitigation, the question becomes a little bit different, but for purposes of the working group with the focus on BA level market power, just thought I would provide that BA level perspective there. Now, when there's grouping that's done, there can be, in the grouping approach, you can be combined with suppliers from another balancing area in which the pivotal suppliers that form your group are not ones that are physically located in your balancing area. And so when we talk today about, potentially thinking about mitigating only pivotal suppliers, it could be possible in that case where a group is considered mitigated and you're part of that mitigated group, but the pivotal suppliers that are mitigated are not ones that are located in your BAA. So that technically could be subject to change depending on how we move forward with the concepts that we'll discuss in the second part of this discussion today. Next slide, please. There were questions about whether the competitive LMP could be negative. Technically, it's true that competitive LMP could be negative. Just to point out that the mitigation process applies both to or compares bids to two different competitive reference prices, the competitive LMP and the default energy bid. So even if there was a negative competitive LMP in a location, you would still mitigate to the higher of the DEB or the competitive LMP in that case. Then finally, there were some questions about the mechanics of bid mitigation, whether mitigation is applied segment by segment or done to the entire bid curve. So we confirmed in the call that mitigation is done segment by segment. Only segments above the competitive LMP are subject to mitigation. And there was also a follow-on question that if multiple segments end up at the same mitigated price, they would be combined into a single segment to maintain the monotonically increasing bids. If it were the case where the default energy bid had the same price for different submitted segments, the mitigated bid would collapse those segments into one section. Were there any other major open questions or things that were discussed that anybody wants to bring up before we move on to the next topic?
Hi, James. It's Callie Wells with WPTF. Through this conversation, I had one additional question, and I don't expect an answer today, but if you guys can think through it and include it in the next presentation, that would be great. But when you think about BA level market power mitigation, the premise is there's participants in a BAA that because of the way they are bidding within that BAA, they're inflating the price in that BAA. This whole approach that we've talked about, first identify, are the MECs separated, is there price separation there? And then if that's the case, we're going to start testing for BA level market power mitigation. Are there any other reasons why the MECs might be different other than the way participants are bidding in that BAA? So if we can think through that, because one does come to mind that we've talked about in another policy effort that can create price separation that's not due to the way participants are bidding in a specific BA. And I think it would be useful to kind of identify all those reasons and talk through them, especially if we continue down this route of using price separation of the MECs as kind of that trigger.
Thank you. I'd be happy if you would elaborate on a way you think it could happen so that it can help us put us in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple, right? So I'll start with the first one, and it's if you have, for example, California ISOBA has a ton of renewable resources. It's middle of the day. We're exporting as much as we possibly can to the other BAAs, but there's so much that you've now caused price separation between the two BAAs. And it's actually the BA that we're trying to get all that renewable resources to that is then tested for market power mitigation, even though that price separation didn't result because of the way they were bidding in their BAA. It was because California had so much renewable resources they were trying to get rid of and export. So that's one. The other one that's a little bit more technical, and is the GHG price formation. We have gone through some scenarios, and I know we're talking about price formation in that effort. Some scenarios where you can actually get some of the GHG costs showing up in the MEC. And that will cause price separation, not because of the way certain participants are bidding in one BA, but just because of the way the current GHG price formation kind of can embed itself into the MEC.
Thanks for that. That helps us think more about that. George, I see your hand up. Do you want to make any comments?
Yes, specifically for the impact of the greenhouse gas model. So we separated the BAA with the greenhouse gas regulation areas. They're like different definitions, and the greenhouse gas component of the LMP, it's different from the marginal energy component of the LMP. The marginal energy component of the LMP applies to a BAA. The marginal greenhouse gas component of the LMP applies to a greenhouse gas regulation area, which may be including BAAs or intersecting with BAAs, but it's a different definition, a different element. And these are different components. We do not mitigate the greenhouse gas component. We always consider it competitive because there is those greenhouse gas bids that drive potentially this component, they're already mitigated the fact that you cannot bid anything you want for a greenhouse gas bid. There is a resource specific cap and a default cap that basically lines up with the emission of the specific resource that submits the bid. So when it comes to the MEC that we test for mitigation here, the MEC is really driven by the bids, the energy bids that are submitted, and it always happens to be a marginal bid. Whatever resource is marginal for meeting demand in that BAA, that resource its bid sets the MEC, and it could be an internal resource, of course, or it could even be a resource outside the BAA if the transfers are not binding and that BAA is the price is set from external resource that is marginal. So I'm not sure I understand the question here, and also the specific tie with the greenhouse gas component. It's a different component, doesn't even have mitigation. So I don't know exactly what the question is. I hope the answer here is satisfactory. Otherwise, we may have more discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it, George. I'm happy to follow up offline. I didn't want to get into the nuances of it. It's not about the separate component. It's about how the price formation works. And we went through a couple edge cases in that working group process that showed that the MEC itself is actually impacted by the GHG design, which is one of the questions raised in terms of the price formation over there. But happy, James, to follow up offline and kind of walk through that scenario. And again, but the point is just to see if there are other reasons why we might see the MECs separate that's not due to the way participants are bidding in the BAA that's being tested for market power. Thanks.
But I'm not sure this is a right statement, Kali. I mean, obviously bids drive the solution, and the solution is a co-optimized solution across multiple commodities over the entire market area. So if you're asking what affects the MEC, the answer is everything can affect the MEC, even the greenhouse gas bid, because it's used for attributions which actually cause economic displacement of internal resources with external resources for a greenhouse gas regulation area. So everything matters. Everything has at least a second order effect. But I don't understand where you're going with this. We mitigate energy bids because they may result in an MEC for a BAA that was assessed to be uncompetitive. This is the right thing to do, is it not?
Well, that's the question that I'm hoping that we can discuss at some point, is whether or not using the price separation due to binding transfer constraints is the only reason why you might get different MECs, and whether or not that aligns with the intent and premise of BAA level market power mitigation, which is, are participants in a given BAA bidding in a way to inflate their prices? I don't mean to take up so much airtime on this. It was just another question I wanted to throw out there that we can hopefully continue to think through in the next meeting.
Callie, while we have you, this might be the right time to kind of talk about, is this the right trigger to test for BAAs being competitive? Like, when we've thought about this internally, it does seem like a reasonable trigger if one BAA is transmission isolated and now price separated structurally. The potential for market power is what we're proposing to test for. The example that I think has been raised in the last two working groups in the comments of, could a BAA be price separated due to very low cost VERS in the broader system, and would it be appropriate to test? It on principle would seem to be appropriate if they're price separated because there is low cost gas in the broader footprint and there's still a price separation. It would similarly maybe be appropriate to test for structural competitiveness in the BAA that is price separated. So can you at least kind of help us think about how you're seeing this, about why that wouldn't be the right trigger? It just, what the broader prevailing prices doesn't seem to impact the potential for structural competitiveness, at least from how we've thought about this.
Yeah, and that's what I was kind of hoping is to get, I know you guys had internal conversations on this and led you to continue down this path, and I was hoping to kind of bring that conversation to the broader stakeholder. So another way to think about it is, you know, phrasing it in the way is, if we're testing for market power mitigation to see if participants in a given BAA are bidding in a way to inflate their price, if that's the premise, then does it make sense to mitigate participants or resources in a BAA because of the way other resources in another BAA are bidding? And it's that question. And it's, and again, I know I didn't mean to take up so much airtime here, but it's thinking through that, because I know one of the other topics is a conduct and impact test. And so it's comparing those two, right? And they have kind of slightly different triggers, and it's seeing if one is better aligned with the intent of BAA or system level market power than the other. So it might make more sense to have this conversation when we get to the conduct and impact test, because you could structure it in a slightly different way to where the trigger is something different. Danny, I think you're muted.
I think the trigger is the same. The context and impact is just, do we think that trigger should matter? And what the ISO is kind of laying out here isn't that we would mitigate a resource if the prices are very low in the broader footprint. It's just, does that serve as a reasonable trigger to start testing for if structural market power even exists in the first place?
Yeah, and I'm hoping what we can talk about in the conduct and impact test is how the other ISOs do it, and see, because I know the California ISO does it in a very unique manner, and I think there's been some conversations a long time ago that looked at how the other ISOs mitigate and in their conduct and impact test, and it'd be nice to kind of bring that back up so we can really sit there and think through how other ISOs are doing it and why, and then see if the way the CAISO is proposing to do it aligns with all of that. So thank you.
I can happily confirm that James does have slides on how the other ISOs do it, and it's not a last word thing, but I just want to be clear, the ISO is not proposing to mitigate any resources because of the prevailing prices in the broader competitive system. It simply, is this a trigger for, should we even test for structural competitiveness? But I'll turn it back to you, James, and hopefully we can get to those slides to further this discussion.
Thanks for your contributions, Danny and George. And thanks for the questions, Callie.
Yeah, thanks. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Got another quick question. Respectfully, I just want to, so the second question here, you got questions about mechanics of bid mitigation. I have a very small clarification, James, to what you have on the slide. I'd like to ask you to also update it to be slightly more accurate. There is a slightly more accurate, just tweak. I think it's literally the language that's on the slide, but it could be read wrong, or it could be confusing if someone doesn't have context. Does that make sense? So I super respectfully would just clarify that. So the local market power mitigation, we run this test, right? And we identify, the last step is a resource test to identify whether or not the resource is located on the system in at a location where it has an incentive to exercise local market power. The trigger for that is the non-competitive LMP. So the LMP non-competitive, that's just the non-competitive constraints, what that would look like. That if that's greater than 0, then the entire resource fails the test. What then happens is it's mitigated to the higher of its DEB or the competitive LMP. But this is a nuance, but it's important because I don't want people walking away being confused. There's not like a partial mitigation. You are fully mitigated, but the price of your mitigated bid will differ in each segment. I do think that's what you've said here is the outcome, but the way it's explained could be confusing. And I'd like to ask you to just tighten this up, if you could revise it to make it clear that mitigation is done at the resource level. The mitigated bid is different by the bid segment, and it is the higher of the DEB or the competitive LMP. Does that nuance make sense? I'm just worried someone might get confused.
Yeah, I agree with that language. You're right. What I intended to, you had the right intention of what I was trying to say, and I understand the way you put it, how that may be confusing.
Yeah, I understood.
I agree with you.
You are, I'm not just, we're in violent agreement. I just am looking at it as from the lens of someone who could look at this slide and not be on this call. And I appreciate you with the clarity. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, this is Vijay Singh from Pacificor. Just have like a few foundational questions first, and then maybe like a broader question. So first, can you confirm that the 3 pivotal supplier test is used for local market power mitigation and that the transfer ties between BAAs are not considered in local MPM?
So yes, the 3 pivotal supplier test is used in local MPM, and I don't, as to how transfer resources, if there is a transfer resource that has a shift factor contribution to the constraint, then it's included, but it's not the same sort of process as it's done for BA level market power, because the LMPM process is doing a power flow assessment, and the BA level market power is on a scheduling limit. And so it's not quite the same.
Okay. So I'm just trying to think through, like, say in a situation where there was no BAA level market power mitigation, only local, and power flows across the transfers were considered. Have you thought through like what the effect of that would be, I guess?
So yeah, that's a good question, and I think it kind of ties into some of the earlier questions about if the trigger is important. And you know, we don't model the physical flows across the transfer points because these scheduling limits are much more restrictive in this case. And so if you were to change the test to say, okay, we're only going to model the physical transmission limit at each intertie location, and just apply, lump that into local market power mitigation, then you're missing price separation that can occur because of the scheduling limit, which is not a flow-based, is not a power flow-based limit. It's based on supply and demand of the BAAs. And so there would still exist the potential for local constrained areas to exist because of scheduling limits that would be missed if you were not to include them in the BA level test. And that is under the assumption, the continued assumption that scheduling limits tend to be more restrictive than physical limits on interties. If that were not true, if the physical and scheduling limits were the same, then it might make more sense to lump it all as LMPM together. But does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely that makes sense, and appreciate the clarification.
Thank you for the question. All right, just want to confirm that the hands that are raised are old. Okay, good. All right. Okay, so I hope that was helpful, and I appreciate the input from folks, and we can make some adjustments to these slides when we post them to make sure that they're as accurate as they can be. But let's move on in this presentation to the next topic, which is beyond what we discussed in the last working group, which relates to pivotal suppliers. And so one of the topics that was raised in the phase 1 working group is whether the CAISO should consider in the BA level test to mitigate only pivotal suppliers and not mitigate all suppliers that are providing counterflow to an uncompetitive constraint. And so we'll walk through that in this set of slides. Next slide, please. And I just want to reiterate again before we start that these slides are conceptual and exploratory. There are no proposals in here. There are no, there's no staff recommendations here. These are only intended to queue up conversation and discussion. So please keep that in mind as we move forward. This is a flowchart of the dynamic competitive path assessment with the language here specific for the BA level test. And so we've had this in the discussion paper. We walked through this in the November 6th session, but essentially, if I could walk through it quickly, the the DCPA for the BA level test begins when a BAA is price separated from the CAISO BAA. And they can be price separated individually or with other BAs in a group. Then if the BAs that are price separated have a marginal energy cost that exceeds the CAISOs, the DCPA assesses whether or not the internal generation is competitive to meet the BA's power balance using a 3 pivotal supplier test. If the BA has a marginal energy cost that's below the CAISOs in the status quo, no mitigation is applied. If the DCPA determines that the BAA does not have sufficient competitive generation to meet its power balance using a 3 pivotal supplier test, then the bids in the balancing area are evaluated. The supply offers are in the balancing area that is uncompetitive are evaluated and compared to both the resource's specific default energy bid and the competitive LMP at that resource's location. If the bids that are submitted were higher than both of these reference prices, those bids are mitigated down to the competitive level. If the bids are lower than those reference prices, either one or both of them, then no mitigation is applied to those bids. Also, if the DCPA, a BA is price separated above the CAISO and the DCPA finds that the BAA does have sufficient competitive generation to meet its power balance, then no mitigation is applied. And again, this DCPA applies specifically to BAs participating in the EIM and the future EDAM outside of the CAISO BAA. And we'll have discussions in future working group meetings whether that assumption should continue or not. Next slide, please. Okay, so next we'll talk about the concept of pivotal suppliers. The textbook definition of a pivotal supplier is a market participant either on its own or a group of affiliated participants that act as a single entity whose actions can have a significant impact on market prices. So in the CAISO, in the context of our market power test, we use the term potentially pivotal suppliers to indicate that those are the 3 net sellers that control the largest quantity of counterflow to an uncompetitive constraint. And that's done on a portfolio basis. So in forming the residual supply index, the market power tests in the CAISO identify potentially pivotal suppliers, which are the 3 largest net sellers that are supplying counterflow to that constraint. And the portfolio is described on the 3rd bullet, includes all generation resources that market participants or its affiliates control, either directly owned or through its affiliates, plus any virtual supply awards that they hold. So the residual supply index does account for the virtual supply submitted by a supplier in its portfolio of counterflow to any uncompetitive any constraint. So again, to review, the concept of a pivotal supplier in the CAISO context relates to the 3 largest suppliers that are providing counterflow supply to an uncompetitive constraint. For local market power, that's counterflow supply directly to a transmission constraint. For BA level market power, that's counterflow supply to the power balance constraint, which is effectively all resources within the balancing area. Next slide, please. So then for each transmission constraint or for the power balance constraint in the context of BA level NPM, we want to make sure we understand a couple of these terms. First, the supply of counterflow is the amount of energy that potentially pivotal suppliers can withhold from the counterflow. And so that includes its operational characteristics and essentially accounts for any amount of capacity that can be withheld from those suppliers, counts as supply of counterflow. Effectively, another way to think about supply of counterflow is these are suppliers who can alleviate or improve congestion, essentially. And so the supply of counterflow alleviates and helps some sort of congestion. Then fringe supply of counterflow, or we might call them fringe competitive suppliers, are the amount of energy that other market participants who are not the three potentially pivotal suppliers can provide as counterflow to that constraint. Finally, you have the demand for counterflow, which is the total demand for energy that relies on the counterflow across the constraint. And basically how the RSI is constructed, as we walked through on the November 6th call, is that if the fringe supply of counterflow is less than the demand for counterflow, it indicates that the potentially pivotal suppliers could withhold their supply and significantly restrict the flow of electricity across the constrained path and potentially impact the price in that area. And for BA level market power, that can be sort of restated to say that the potentially pivotal suppliers could withhold their supply and cause the balancing area not to have sufficient supply to meet their own power balance with only the competitive supply. Next slide, please. So in the CAISO market, pivotal suppliers are not the only suppliers that are mitigated. All suppliers that provide counterflow to an uncompetitive constraint, be it a local transmission constraint or the power balance constraint, are subject to mitigation and not just the pivotal suppliers. So again, in the context of BA level market power, this means all suppliers in the BA are subject to mitigation when the BA is deemed uncompetitive in the BA level test. And that is the assumption that we are exploring in this set of slides here, whether that should continue. Next slide, please. So these are some reasons supporting mitigation of non-pivotal suppliers, and on the next slide will be some reasons why maybe you wouldn't want to mitigate non-pivotal suppliers. In the CAISO context, non-pivotal status does not necessarily mean a supplier cannot exert market power. So pivotal suppliers in the CAISO context are just the top 3 net seller portfolios, but there may be non-pivotal suppliers who could be part of a pivotal group. And that will get into some of the concepts we'll talk about later, where if you wanted to consider not mitigating non-pivotal suppliers, how you might achieve that. For example, if you replace the 3rd largest supplier with the 4th largest supplier, the 1st, 2nd, and 4th largest supplier may also form a pivotal group. And so therefore you can't say that just because the 4th largest supplier has non-pivotal status as it relates to the potentially pivotal suppliers, doesn't mean that the 4th largest supplier could not exercise market power with the 1st and 2nd largest. Second bullet, the presence of pivotal suppliers indicates a market structure issue. It does not indicate which suppliers can exert market power. So the pivotal supplier test and the RSI is an indication of market concentration of supply, and the test itself is to test the market structure, the concentration of market structure at any location. So in and of itself, the concept of pivotal supplier as it applies to the CAISO is not intended to indicate which suppliers can exert market power or not. Third, by mitigating all suppliers that can provide counterflow to a constraint, it absolves gaming opportunities that could potentially happen around pivotal and non-pivotal thresholds. And so if there were opportunities for suppliers to adjust their portfolios in order to position themselves and gain pivotal or non-pivotal status at certain times, that could, the opportunity for strategic behavior may be there. That is a theoretical concept and not an indictment of any market participant, but just the idea that if you have defined thresholds above which you're pivotal, below which you're not, it may invite potential strategic behavior if you don't design the rules very, very tightly. Fourth, it's possible, albeit not very likely, but theoretically one could be concerned that the CAISO does a 3 pivotal supplier test to indicate whether or not a group of suppliers could possibly either explicitly or tacitly collude to increase market prices at their location. Obviously, the more suppliers that you include, it's much more difficult to coordinate that sort of behavior. However, it's not impossible that more than 3 suppliers could coordinate to influence prices at any location. And so for that, in that case, you may be increasing the number of false positives that happen because of the market power test. And in short, the method of mitigating all suppliers that provide counterflow is consistent, conservative, and protective. And the question then becomes, is it overly conservative and overly protective? Is the balance appropriate? Let's take the question before moving to the next slide.
Thank you, James. This is JK Wang from PG&E. I really appreciate the thorough discussion here and all of the considerations, but I have a clarifying question here. Are we only discussing mitigation of non-pivotal suppliers, or we're kind of like revisiting whether the pivotal supplier test is still the right test to use? And I'm putting the question forward because I think the two are closely related. Like a few of the considerations listed here, for example, like whether the pivotal suppliers, the largest suppliers, are able to exercising market power. This is basically why we're using the RSI test. The test itself is designed to test that specific type of market power only defined on the capacity. So I think I would appreciate some clarity. Or we only look at after the test is done, where we'll consider this together with the possibility of revisiting the test as well?
I think it's a little bit of both. And there is a concept that we'll put forward in which I think you'll see that it's both related to the definition of what is a pivotal supplier and the actual test itself. That may change. I think they're connected. And so hold that thought until I think it's maybe 2 more slides from now, in which we'll talk about if you wanted to mitigate only non-pivotal suppliers, what that might look like, a conceptual idea.
Okay. Yeah, I will hold that. Yeah, I think it's just, for my understanding of the test itself, it does not consider other things. It just, the test itself is designed based on the capacity, and it does not, it holds, just as you said, it's an economic concept and a test, right? So for economic test, it holds a lot of assumption, there's no conclusion, things like that. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll hold my thought.
Yeah, and I'll say it connects to something I mentioned earlier, which is that the RSI is not, and the term pivotal supplier is not intended to identify which suppliers have market power or are exercising market power. The RSI is a test of structural, market concentration only. And the outcome of the RSI, if the RSI fails, is to say that this constrained area is not structurally competitive, because the 3 largest suppliers could, together withhold their supply and exert influence over the market price. And any supplier that does not have that sort of influence, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they try to exert market power, they would price themselves right out of competition. There'd be sufficient competition to overtake them. Whereas for, suppliers that have market power, they have that ability to influence the market price. So I think you're onto something. That you're right, that and that's why I'm trying to say the pivotal status is not an indication of who can exert market power necessarily. It's just a labeling for the test purposes to evaluate the concentration of suppliers in a given area. Thanks for the question. Next question, please.
Hey, this is BJ from Pacific Oregon. Just on your bullet about gaming opportunities, just thinking in terms of like the EIM, would this even be possible since like most EIM entities, like the largest suppliers are the entities themselves? Like I'm just trying to think if this is actually something that could happen within EIM entities.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in that case, you would definitely have a dominant firm or a dominant supplier. Now it would just be within the remaining two entities, or the remaining two supply entities that are lumped together for purposes of RSI, because the RSI test looking at the three largest suppliers in that case. And so in that context, it would potentially implicate the other two. They'd be much smaller than the dominant firm for sure, but it would implicate others, I would think.
Okay, thank you.
And to add on, yeah, and to add on, Vijay, my understanding is that most of the time, because of that that type of market structure, that when a BAA fails when a BAA is price separated, they do tend to fail the RSI, because the concentration of supply does tend to not enable them to pass the RSI-3 test. And so again, that's sort of part of the point of the grouping approach too, is that if you're price separated with 6 other balancing areas, now you're able to consider the supply. You would still find the three largest suppliers of that group, but then you may have access to much larger entities in the group with which to pass the RSI-3 test. Hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful.
Great. All right, let's move to the next slide. So again, these are theoretical arguments, or I'm trying to make textbook arguments. These aren't these slides don't represent necessarily the opinion of anybody in the CAISO price formation team, but just to stimulate discussion, here are some arguments about why you might not want to mitigate non-pivotal suppliers. So by definition, a non-pivotal supplier cannot unilaterally influence market outcomes. And I use unilaterally as doing a lot of work here because the CAISO, well, in electricity markets, the 3 pivotal supplier test is important. And so if you had an RSI-1 test where you're only looking at 1 pivotal supplier, then this would hold. Now, it would be the case in the 3 pivotal supplier test that you would need the largest supplier in coordination with the other 2 second largest suppliers to be able to withhold and exert pressure over the market price. But if you are not pivotal by definition, and this is not the CAISO's definition in the RSI test, but just the textbook definition of non-pivotal, you cannot unilaterally influence market outcomes. And such, those small suppliers are by nature price takers, which means that they have no incentive other than to bid their marginal cost, because anything above their marginal cost, they have no influence over the market price, and therefore bidding anything over the marginal cost reduces their competitiveness in the market clearing process. And furthermore, as I mentioned, we have an RSI-3 test. Coordination becomes significantly more difficult the more suppliers you add to the RSI or to the test. So if it was an RSI-1 test, obviously you wouldn't need the pivotal supplier to be coordinated with any other suppliers to withhold in order to exert power of the market price. But it could be the case where, in this case, as you add suppliers that you're testing in the RSI, the more you add, the harder it is for those firms to collude and exert power over the price. Mitigation of in that context, mitigation of non-pivotal suppliers could be seen as overly restrictive market intervention and increase type 1 errors, which basically is that you are mitigating a supplier even though they do not have the potential to exert market power. And so that would be, in this case, an example of a type 1 error here. If there were overly too many type 1 errors, that would suppress legitimate price signals and lead to less efficient market operations because you're having reasonably competitive prices being mitigated to different levels and therefore changing the market price signals and operations. And in the longer run, discourage efficient market entry and investment if you are citing resources in areas that are frequently mitigated, and the test is overly stringent, then it may discourage efficient market entry and investment, especially for smaller suppliers. Question on the slide?
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities group. Can you explain how the two bullets could simultaneously be true? In other words, the first bullet is saying non-pivotal suppliers can't move the market. They're sort of inherently limited to inherently incentivized to bid at their marginal cost, but then the second bullet is saying, but you're going to be overly restrictive and somehow suppress their bids. They don't seem to go together.
Yeah, so I guess the idea is that it comes down to, well, let me put it this way. So if there is sufficient competition, then there is no better competitive reference price for what the cost of that resource is than the resource's own bid. And in this context, we are assuming that, in this case, that the default energy bid of that resource and or the competitive LMP represents a more competitive price than the one that the supplier submits. And that is, I guess, the assumption here that you're saying you would be assuming that the DEB and the competitive LMP represents a better understanding of the competitive price of that resource than the resource owner does. And I think that could be a flawed assumption if there is sufficient competition in the market, that there is no better competitive reference price than the scheduling coordinator's own bid for that resource. So I think that's how you would connect the two. And it could be the case, it could definitely be the case that the bid that is submitted is regularly lower than the default energy bid and competitive LMP, in which case there would be no impact. But at the same time, if you're saying that, non-pivotal suppliers are price takers and then have incentives to bid their marginal cost, and you're subjecting them to mitigation, comparing them to default energy bids and competitive LMPs that are below the cost that they submit, seems to me, sort of a violation of the theory that sufficient competitions will cause or will incentivize suppliers to bid their marginal cost.
Thanks. Thanks for the explanation.
Thanks for the question.
Hey, James, I was unmuted. I think I'm next in the queue. Just because I was unmuted while Bonnie was talking, I thought I'd just jump in because I might have gotten lost. But thanks for unmuting me. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. No, I actually kind of wanted to take a bit of a devil's advocate approach here with this slide, if that's all right. As we think through this, it's I actually want to stress test, and I appreciate you doing like putting this out here and trying to come up with like very theoretical but sound kind of arguments and taking two sides of the coin. That is, I think that's a great way to do this. But so, okay, looking at this side of the coin, the idea that mitigation of non-pivotal suppliers would suppress legitimate price signals and discourage efficient market entry and investment. I'd like to push back on that and argue that I don't know that I don't think that is that's not necessarily always true. That statement could be true if the price formation of the market is challenged at the same time. So where I think of, and trying to elevate this to like the policy level, right? When we talk about these debates and like make this a little higher level. If you could be, let's say, you could mitigate all resource bids. And if you were pricing the amount of supply, like if you were pricing the conditions on the system accurately, where it reflects the actual supply and demand fundamentals, I don't know that it does suppress legitimate price signals or discourage efficient market entry. Now, if you mitigate significantly, there's a large frequency of mitigation, and the level that you're mitigating is much lower than a reasonable incremental cost, either of those scenarios, yes, that can be incredibly punitive and very disruptive to the market, which is why folks like me jump in and say, oh, this could be really bad. But part of that is also that I don't have confidence in the price formation. And those are some of the things we've been talking about in the scarcity track, right? But these things are connected. So if you were to put forward a package that said we want to apply stricter mitigation, but we are going to pair that with accurate and legit price signals that are going to value supply and demand accurately across the system, I'm going to receive that package very differently than if you put forward something that was a pretty strict hammer and would lead to over mitigation without price formation, where I would be concerned that when you're mitigating it, the prices are going to be set by those mitigated bids during an instance where it was over mitigation. So if you can address that concern, my devil's advocate position is I'm not sure this last bullet is accurate. And I wanted to tease this debate out because I think this is the crux of it.
Appreciate that. Yeah, and I agree that the practical effect of number 2 is subject to question, and it depends on the degree, both of which the frequency and the level of mitigation. I totally agree with that. In this context, though, we're not talking about more strict mitigation. We're talking about less strict mitigation because the bullet is intending to say, if we continue to mitigate non-pivotal suppliers, that could be seen as overly restrictive given the discussion we had in the first bullet. And if that was true consistently and at a high enough magnitude, as you mentioned, then the second 2 bullets follow.
And see,
that you're mitigating. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I don't. So I think the distinction between the pivotal and non-pivotal is less relevant. So maybe I don't buy into the first bullet, which is part of why I probably I made my scenario much more. To me, the risk of over mitigation occurs today in our design, where you can be over mitigating a resource, and so that's why we have the frequently mitigated unit process, where we can come in and say, hey, we're getting mitigated a ton, and we need an adder in our our devs to address that concern. This concept of relating it to the price formation is an issue that we have today, regardless of if you expand this to CAISO. And when I say over mitigation, I think I'm looking at it from that lens of you're proposing to add another kind of mitigation to the CAISO BAA that doesn't exist, right? And so whether or not you apply it in a way that leads to over mitigation. How concerned I'm going to be about that is going to be tied to the improvements that you make on your price formation.
I see.
I just think it's an
it helps
interesting
yeah.
way to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, it helps to get the context that you're talking about it in context of the CAISO BAA specifically, because this is not, yeah, I agree. From the CAISO BAA's context, if you're adding on the BA level test, but then saying, oh, but we're only going to mitigate the non-pivotal suppliers, that's still more mitigation than the status quo. For the rest of the EIM, though, it would be the opposite, but
that's also a helpful
helps.
clarification. Yeah, thank you for going through that thought exercise. Can you, one last question before, and I think it's useful and I hope that's useful for others to remember they're connected. But my question is there a strong, is there an advocacy for you to do this? Or is this more of a thought exercise? I mean, yeah, this makes sense.
For the non-pivotal supplier part? Or the CAISO BA part?
The pivotal versus non-pivotal. I'm just trying to figure out where it's originating from. I'm sure it's been discussed. I just can't recall, and I would appreciate a reminder.
As far as I'm aware, the strongest, we received feedback from the Market Surveillance Committee to look at this concept more closely. I think that was the strongest origination of it, and there may have been others that chimed in support. And so I think that's where this originates from.
That's really helpful. I was confused because when I think about system tests, I'm not familiar with the pivotal supplier element being included. So when you get to your summary of the other markets, I didn't believe that that was a part of conduct and impact. But I know you're not proposing that, but if I'm thinking about it in that lens, I'm also trying to make sure that we're understanding and I intuitively understand why the markets that don't make this distinction under a conduct and impact are doing that, because it would distort the results of what they're trying to do. So I'll loop back to, I'm just trying to understand what risks we're really trying to test for and what we're trying to make sure we're mitigating. I understand those tests. And so I'm just working towards understanding this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the comments. Okay, okay. One more question on this slide.
Yeah, James, this is Alva at PG&E. Just one thing I'm curious about is, so if you have a case in which non-pivotal suppliers are not mitigated, isn't the result of that almost bound to be one in which the pivotal suppliers are always clearing the market and the non-pivotal suppliers are left out? I guess if they're not bidding higher than the pivotal suppliers, then they can still be part of the competitive price setting. But if they're not being mitigated, there's sort of an assumption that they might be bidding higher than the pivotal suppliers. So is that tending to lead to results in which the pivotal suppliers actually are always the ones who clear the market in the local area?
I understand the question, but I'm not sure I know the answer, because I think it would depend. That would be an interesting thing to investigate. But I think it just depends on the nature of the cost of the non-pivotal suppliers. In some cases, the natural cost structure of those competitive suppliers are going to be higher than the pivotal suppliers, in which case, you know, they're
that's the result.
Not exactly, the non-pivotal suppliers are not the ones that are clearing the market. And we're not, I don't think, I hope you don't read this as the intention here being to try to get non-pivotal suppliers to clear the market easier. It is just to
no, just the opposite.
It is essentially
if you don't mitigate, then it's less likely they'll clear the market. So that's the
right. But then at the same, you know, it just depends on the level. I mean, the theory would say that if they're not pivotal, they don't have any, they can't withhold their supply and exert influence over the price, then they have the incentive to competitively bid their price. And so whatever price they end up submitting best represents their cost. And if that's lower than the pivotal suppliers, then they're taken. And if it's higher, then they're not taken. But it should just order them in the correct way, I guess, is hopefully the outcome.
Right. I sort of followed that argument that you're making. But on the other hand, if their default energy bids are their cost-based bids, then essentially what you're saying is the reason that their bids should be accepted is because they're correctly assessing their opportunity costs and for the most efficient market solution, whereas the largest suppliers may not be, and then you're essentially removing that opportunity cost element from the pivotal suppliers on the assumption that they're including market power in in what they're building into their opportunity costs. So the end result is that you're going to tend to get something which is below the opportunity cost, clearing the market, and the bids that you're calling the most efficient bids might end up not being the ones that clear the market. I mean, I know this is sort of tangential. I just, since you had it up on the screen, I was thinking about that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good thought. And I'll take it one more step. That if you were to be like a P equals MC fundamentalist, right? And you were in that situation where you are a non-pivotal supplier and your DEB is routinely below your submitted bid, you would be more likely to say it's the DEB that's wrong. It's not my bid that's wrong. And so I think it implicates potential issues in the DEB more than it would in the bid itself if those conditions were sufficient to, enable this sort of behavior.
Right, but the pivotal suppliers would be in exactly the same boat. They would just have this additional element that potentially they could introduce into that problem of whether the DEB is correct. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and in that case, they get less benefit of the doubt because they have, more power. They have more incentive to include, we'll call it market power components of price into their bids, which DEBs may pick up on and prevent, which would be the efficient thing to do. So I guess, it comes down to the sort of type 1 error issue where if you are mitigating resources that don't have the incentive to exercise market power, then you're putting a lot of faith in DEBs as the, efficient, proper price for that resource, and how it then clears the market changes the price signal and the operation of the grid at that point. Okay, thanks, Albus, for those points. That was good. I think we're ready to move on to the next slide. This is just a concept for discussion. It's not a proposal, but just for get some people thinking about something. If you were convinced by the previous slide that mitigating non-pivotal suppliers is not a good thing, then this may be something that can be done about it. You could focus mitigation measures only on suppliers that form a pivotal group, okay? And remember, we run an RSI-3 test, and so the test is looking at whether a group of 3 suppliers could withhold their capacity and there would be insufficient supply left over to, relieve the constraint or solve the power balance constraint in the VA level test. So what you might do is that instead of automatically mitigating all suppliers or using a fixed number like the top 3 suppliers, the idea would be that you would start with the top 3 suppliers. If those suppliers are pivotal, then you would move to the 4th, you would replace the 3rd supplier with the 4th supplier, and you would test the RSI again. If the 4th supplier inclusion, and if the 4th supplier, along with the 1st and 2nd, is also pivotal, you would move to the 5th supplier, and so on for n number of suppliers, until you find some group of the 1st, 2nd, and nth supplier that is no longer pivotal. And then when you find that nth supplier that forms a non-pivotal group, you don't mitigate the nth supplier, and nor do you mitigate any supplier that has a portfolio lower or smaller than the nth supplier. So again, the concept would be that you're trying to identify in the pivotal supply test which suppliers in the 3 pivotal supplier test could genuinely have the potential to exercise market power as a group of 3, and therefore to avoid unnecessary mitigation of small suppliers. Now, if the top 3 suppliers were tested in the RSI and they passed, then of course nobody's mitigated. And if you go through all of the suppliers' portfolios at that location and find that there is no combination of groups, if you include the first and second largest suppliers that can form a non-pivotal group, then all of the suppliers continue to be mitigated. But it could be the case that once you get to the 4th supplier, that the first, second, and 4th supplier do not form a pivotal group, and therefore you would not mitigate the 4th supplier in any supplier that has a portfolio smaller than that, because essentially you're saying the 4th supplier could not, in combination with the first and second suppliers, withhold enough supply to make this a non-competitive constraint. So that could be a concept. Now, you can't just say, as we talked about, you can't just say the pivotal supplier groups, as they're done today in the test, don't implicate this type of market power. So you can't just say, well, you could, but it would not be optimal, I would think, to just say, well, let's just mitigate the 3 pivotal suppliers in the test as it is today, because again, you could have, potential strategic behavior about how those portfolios are constructed. And again, just the identification of potentially pivotal suppliers is not an indication necessarily that that supplier is actually pivotal. You have to go through this exercise in order to find where the actual distinction between a pivotal and non-pivotal supplier. So if we go to the next slide, we'll go through some trade-offs here. So some concept like this might better reflect the actual ability for suppliers to exercise market power and let these small fish swim free kind of idea, where you don't have small suppliers that are not pivotal subject to market power in those cases. And if done correctly, that could potentially promote more efficient market prices and operational outcomes, because you're reducing the type 1 errors. Essentially to say you're reducing the frequency with which you're mitigating a supplier that actually doesn't have the incentive to exercise market power. Excuse me. And then finally, this could improve, as I mentioned, could improve price signals for longer run economic behavior. Now, of course, there are challenges here. First, it's computationally, identifying a pivotal group dynamically in this sort of process would be computationally intensive, because you'd have to run through this sort of exercise for every location and every binding constraint. And so that may be potentially prohibitive in terms of performance. Second, there's still potential for strategic behavior if suppliers can manipulate their portfolios to avoid mitigation. So it doesn't necessarily completely eliminate, although it does seem to make it easier or less common, I would say less easy to, adjust their portfolios in order to position themselves into a pivotal or non-pivotal place. And then finally, the same way that this could decrease type 1 errors, this could also potentially increase type 2 errors, which is a false negative, which is not mitigating a supplier that may have the opportunity or the incentive to exercise market power. And that kind of comes down to whether the RSI 3 testing the 3 largest suppliers is sufficient to eliminate there's a balance. The more that you test, the fewer type 2 errors there will be. The less that you test, the more type 2 errors there will be, and vice versa. And so you're trying to find a sweet spot of balancing the type 1 and type 2 errors so that you're, mitigating the resources that need to be mitigated and leaving alone the ones that don't. And finding that balance is not necessarily easy. So I think this may be the last slide in this in this discussion. So I'll pause here. If there's anything anybody wants to add on for the concept of potentially mitigating only non-pivotal suppliers. Okay, let's move on to the next section then. We have about 45 minutes. And this relates to an impact test. So we'll talk a little bit about what an impact test is and why, considering it may be beneficial for the BA level test. Let's go to the next slide. So in FERC jurisdictional markets, there are essentially two primary approaches to market power mitigation. CAISO finds itself on the left-hand side with PJM that employ a process called structural market power mitigation, and that involves 3 steps. First, to determine if a market participant, either with a single resource or a portfolio, in our case, CAISO's case, a portfolio of resources, possesses market power, and that is through the 3 pivotal supplier test. If the 3 pivotal supplier test fails, then the constrained area is uncompetitive by our definition, and then you then compare every resource supply offer to a competitive reference level. So in CAISO's case, the competitive reference levels are both the resource's individual default energy bid and the location-specific competitive LMP. If the offered bid is higher than those competitive reference level prices, then the offer is mitigated to the reference level. Now, conduct and impact, as done through ISO New England, MISO New York, and SPP, is essentially the same, except it involves an additional step. So conduct and impact is still identifying whether or not a market participant possesses market power through some sort of structural competitiveness test. Conduct and impact still compares the resources supply offer to competitive reference levels. The third step is the additional step, which is to say that before you go and mitigate, if step 2, you identify that the resource supply offer is higher than the competitive reference level, you take one more step, which is then to evaluate whether the resources offer impacts market clearing prices beyond a predefined threshold. And we'll show those predefined thresholds for the other markets on an upcoming slide. But for example, let's just imagine that the threshold is $100. That means that you will stick with the uncompetitive bid, or I guess you wouldn't even label a bid as uncompetitive, so long as the difference in the submitted offer and its change on the prevailing market price doesn't have more than a $100 impact. If the combination of those 3 tests fail, then you mitigate the offer to the reference level. So again, conduct and impact basically only varies from the structural approach used in CAISO and PJM from the third step. Now, this is the actual implementation of conduct and impact. They may be in slightly different order, but all 3 of those tests exist in some extent. And of course, the way that they're implemented will be different by market, but that's a textbook level look at it. Let's go to the next slide. So in the phase 1 working group, the working group decided to consider an impact test for BA level market power mitigation. And again, an impact test in the context of the CAISO would evaluate whether a generator's bidding behavior both deviates from the expected competitive level by looking at the offer relative to the DEV and the competitive LMP, and materially affects the market price in defining some threshold with which that would be true. The idea being that it could help prevent over-mitigation by only intervening when there are meaningful price effects. So in cases where the unmitigated bid would only lead to, even though it's higher than the competitive LMP, or the default energy bid would only lead to some small change in the market price, you would not mitigate the bid in that situation. Next slide, please. So here's a copy of the DCPA flowchart again, and this is where in red, an impact test would fit into this is conceptual only, this is not a proposal. This hasn't been vetted with CAISO's technology team or anything like that. It's just a concept of where you would think about an impact test taking place among the DCPA steps that exist today. And that is essentially that after the bids are evaluated, the DCPA has already identified the conditions to be uncompetitive, and then is evaluating the bids relative to the DEB and the competitive LMP. And if the bid exceeds both of those levels, there's an additional step in red that goes through before the bids are mitigated, which is to assess if the bid results in a material market price increase. And so you would have to come up with some threshold with which, if the market price increase was less than this threshold, you would not apply mitigation. And if it exceeded this threshold, you would apply mitigation. So hopefully that helps orient people where an impact test would fall in the DCPA. Next slide, please. Okay, we'll pause here for a question.
Thanks, James. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just wanted to share my perspective is that in our current LMPM, now, so if I read this, when you walked through this before, it's just from the no mitigation box all the way down, make a bright line, everything to the left, that's all what's in the WEIM. Everything from the line down and to the right is in CAISO, that's normal steady state. That said, so like my view is that, you know, PJM's 3 pivotal supplier test, which they actually call a 3PS, they don't include an impact portion. When CAISO developed its design, actually one of the things that it added that I thought was a good addition, like I think is a nice thing about CAISO's design, is we added an impact portion. So I just wanted to, one teeny tiny clear, is that we have an impact test today. Sometimes I call it a resource test, but it is an impact test. So when we talk about the resource test, what it is doing is identifying whether or not that resource is in a location where it has the potential to impact prices. It's not the same as did it actually impact prices. I hear you talking through the idea of adding, not relative to BAA, but to our current LMPM. In addition to, we have our constraint test, we have a resource test, the non-competitive LMP flag greater than 0 would lead to mitigation. You're kind of putting out there a concept of doing one more test after the resource test, of adding not just were you locationally situated, where you had an incentive to influence that, to withhold the supply of counterflow, but that prices look like you did that in a way as a third test. Am I understanding what you just talked through right?
I think so. I would just mention that the scope of the price formation enhancements is looking at BA level market power mitigation, and that the idea here would be that anything that would apply, these concepts are intended to apply specifically to the BA level test only. And that is not to say that some of these concepts wouldn't be effective or beneficial in the LMPM context, but for purposes of scope, we're talking specifically about the BA level test.
Okay, so then I misunderstood this chart. I thought everything kind of down and to the right was the normal test. Sorry, I shouldn't call it that. I don't, the standard, I don't know, the traditional, the original, not the WEIM, and to the left. So that's a helpful clarification. So everything here is this new BAA. It has nothing to do with what I think of as like the bread and butter LNPM, or can you clarify for me?
Yeah, the flow chart would be similar for, it was just some of these boxes have different words. For example, like the first decision diamond here where it says BA's MEC is greater than CAISO's MEC. In the LMPM context, that's not the decision point to trigger, you know, the three pivotal supplier test. So it would have a very similar structure, but some of the specifics about what's in the boxes would look a little different. And you're right that this does not apply to the CAISO BA today. Oh, none of this does. As a BA level test, it does not apply to the CAISO today.
Sandy, did you have anything that would be helpful? You're on mute. I can't hear you.
I try to be safe by double muting and it comes back to bite me. I thought you were going to take that actually in a different direction, and that's the existing reference level change request process actually has a buffer on what the reference costs are that can inform any eventual mitigation. And so in some ways, there's some level of buffer already there to try to ensure that there isn't any over mitigation, but then as James is highlighting, this would layer on top of that existing buffer.
No, that's a really helpful addition as well. Thank you both very much. And thanks for that clarification. That helps me better understand. So this is very interesting. So like for CAISO BAA resources, we have a local market power mitigation where there is a form of an impact test. But for the BAA that you apply in the WEAM, you don't currently have that kind of second layer for them. Sorry, my dog agrees. So that's really helpful to compare and contrast. And yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes CAISO's original design superior. I'll say superior because it does have that impact test portion. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Salva, I was going to take this in a different direction, which is that impact. So impact is actual impact, not potential impact. One thing I was curious about it, and this I wondered about in respect to storage and other energy limited resources, is it's very much a part of the CAISO's market design that resources that have energy limits should be able to bid in such a way as to indicate they don't want to be used in particular periods. And that's part of the discussion around the default energy bids, but it has a longer lineage in terms of how the CAISO has advised people to bid into the market in order to avoid schedules they don't want to see. But those bids are generally out of the money bids. And I just wanted to see what your thoughts were in terms of what you might then construe as economic withholding. Would that an impact test determine that such a bid had impacted market prices, or does the bid have to be a marginal bid, an actual resource that in the MPM phase is dispatched on its bid in order to be considered to have an impact in such an impact test?
So it essentially adds in another layer to beyond just whether the bid exceeds the DEB in the competitive LMP, notwithstanding the issues relating to whether the current storage DEB or any other DEB captures,
right,
short run marginal costs appropriately, that if it were to exceed those levels, you would not by default mitigate until you assessed whether that submitted bid results in some meaningful change in the LMP at that location. And so let's just say we had a threshold of $5 for simplicity, and you were to have a bid that you're evaluating that exceeds the DEB and the competitive LMP, but then when you actually use that that submitted bid in the market clearing process only changes the, or only, I'm sorry, if you were to use the mitigated bid and it were only to change the LMP by some small threshold, then you would move forward with the unmitigated bid, because by mitigating, you hadn't materially, whatever that, you haven't met the threshold for how much that bid needs to affect the locational marginal price in order to be mitigated.
Okay, so that seems promising for. I'm just trying to think, like you had it's sort of the case of the three pivotal suppliers. The third doesn't want to be operated. The fourth pivotal supplier comes in there, and you've got, potentially prices being affected, but in the way you're describing it, the impact test would say that since if the third pivotal supplier had been in the market, it wouldn't have had an effect on the price. You wouldn't mitigate it, and hopefully this would enable energy limited resources to be able to, in general, keep their bids where they do not want to be operated, keep them at higher levels, and see results consistent with that, assuming that like you say, the effect of them trying to get out of the stack would not have a material effect on price. But it could be.
It brings up an interesting.
Sorry.
Yeah, if I could, it will. You're bringing up an interesting concept, because the answer to that question can vary depending on how it's implemented. I'm not 100% sure, but I would be willing to bet that the implementations of an impact test across other markets are not doing a resource by resource test, because I would think that what's happening is actually that there's only one additional market pass where you're comparing all of the mitigated bids to the price impact of that location of all of the unmitigated bids. And if the combination of those bids exceeds the price change for the combination of those bids exceeds the threshold, then you mitigate all of the bids like you would. But it's not to say I'm going to go supplier by supplier and then test, because think about how exponentially, how many market runs exponentially would grow, because you'd have to test with and without every single individual supplier wouldn't work that way. So you're doing them as a group. You're testing all of the unmitigated bids, looking at the impact that would have relative to the mitigated bids. And if the group, if the culminating effect exceeds the threshold, then you continue to mitigate those bids as normal. And if not, then you leave them all unmitigated. So you're looking at across the entire portfolio at once.
That would almost make me want to see it mitigation applied all or to all or none in a case where there is market power. But
yeah, and it could be if you combine this discussion with the one we just had previously, all or none could be conditional to say all the pivotal suppliers only, or in the status quo would be all suppliers.
Right.
Right.
With your more expanded version of all the pivotal suppliers, that might be a good way to sort of get somewhere in between the sort of an unwarranted mitigation, but also allow for more flexibility in the bidding among the pivotal suppliers. Thank you.
Right. And I do, yeah, thanks. And I do, I'll just bring up, I don't have all the information, but I'll just bring up that I have, in my research for this call, do understand that this additional step is potentially can be computationally difficult, especially in RTD, because essentially you're thinking about an additional market pass. There may be ways to get around that, and this again, these are conceptual discussions and just at a policy level, and there may be ways to get around that. But I do know that for some markets that have, are doing these impact tests, especially in RTD or their 10-minute, 5-minute markets, that it's not always possible to fit in more market passes and have the salt time be appropriate. And so they have, developed workarounds in some cases to do that. So if the working group is interested in having, investigating more about how that looks like, we can consider that for a future call. But I just will note that it's not, especially in RTD, having an additional market run is potentially, challenging. And other markets have faced that challenge too.
I would favor something that was more like after the fact, you do some kind of aggregation of data and make some determination.
Yeah, I think that is what happened. Yeah, some sort of ex post evaluation to give yourself a little bit more time.
Yeah, with consequences for the future. So sort of like, in a sense, it's going back to Kathleen saying, potential impact is you've had impact in the past, so now you're defined as having potential impact, and you will be included in that set going forward with some vintage, or maybe until the data shows that that's no longer the case.
Yeah. So yeah, those are all good and interesting concepts that we'll have to dig into deeper, depending on how far the working group was willing to go to investigate this sort of approach.
James, before we move on, I heard Alva kind of address, would this be a potential solution for how storage participates in relation to holding kind of state of charge and dictating when it's used? And it might help on the margins, but it's probably not a one-for-one perfect solution for that concern, Alva, because what this is basically doing is, how big of a dead band do you want to insert where you're not going to screen for the potential exercise of market power? And that in and of itself is a loaded policy question. So the larger it gets, obviously, the more control that would give like a storage resource on how they're maintaining and participating, but the bigger gap it creates on the other side for the potential exercise of market power.
Thanks for that comment, Danny. I think you're probably right. I was just look for some silver lining here for being able to actually, I mean, that's such a basic part of bidding energy limited resources that it's hard to not to try to figure out some way to make it work in the market.
Understand.
Hey, James and Danny, this is J.K. Wang from PG&E. I have a quick clarifying question. You may have already answered that, and apologies if I missed that one. So for the impact test, is that separate from the approach you presented before for replacing the nth pivotal supplier in the nth supplier in the pivotal supplier test, or this is something that can be overlapped or combined with that one?
They can be combined. This is separate. So where you would see if you decided, so see in the far right box where it says bids are mitigated to competitive levels.
Right.
That is where you would decide. That is where you would decide if you only wanted to mitigate a subset of the bids, you would do that in that step. So the impact test would happen before the decision about if you wanted to only mitigate the pivotal suppliers, you would still do the impact test first. Because if the impact test passes, then you don't apply mitigation to any of the suppliers. If the impact test fails, then you mitigate the suppliers according to, your procedures in that last step.
Got you. Okay, that's really helpful. Another question I have is just I want to make sure I understand the impact the impact test. How does that work? So is it true that only this impact test will only mitigate the resources that is marginal? In other words, if a capacity, like the current test only looks at capacity, but if those units with a greater capacity, they're actually not marginal units in the impact test, it will not do anything, but it will identify those as marginal units and mitigate their price. Is that right?
That's a good question. So you're right that resources that are non-marginal will, if you allow them to, or may not, if you mitigate non-marginal resources, they will not impact the LMP at the location. Right. However, so what the impact test is doing is to say there's an uncompetitive constraint. We'll start with that. And then you are doing a market run where you're solving with all of the unmitigated bids, which you do in the existing MPM path already. And you're comparing that results to another pass where you're applying the mitigation to all the resources as if you were mitigating them, which is what we would do in the normal ISM or the normal market run today. And you are looking at the delta of the price difference at that location between the two runs. And you're going to say, if the price difference is less than some threshold, I will publish and continue with the unmitigated set of bids. If the delta exceeds the threshold, then you continue with the mitigated set of bids. So it is looking at all of the bids, not just them. Yeah, so it's looking at the difference in the price due to mitigation of all of the bids that would otherwise be mitigated, and not just the marginal or inframarginal suppliers.
Gotcha. Okay, that's really helpful. Follow up on that, when you describe do the impact test by running the optimization again, does that consider the interaction among the BAAs? I assume that when you run this again, there is possibilities like the bidding change in some other BAs might impact the flow and the grouping again, or that's already separated step. I'm just, it seems a lot of things going on here.
Yeah, and it's how much you need to parse out which, in an example that I gave, you're doing one mitigated run, comparing it to an unmitigated run, but you may have, you will need more runs the more granular you want to make the test. So in the BA level concept, thinking back to November 6th, where you have like several groups that are being tested, if part of that test is each time you get to a group and you're testing, you do this impact test, then you're trying to solve, the change in LMP from the mitigated and unmitigated bids. And you may be doing that for every single group. Or you do one single run where, so it just kind of depends on how granular you want to get and how much it's possible for us to assess all those changes in LMPs in the time that we have available to run the market as it exists. So
gotcha.
it's
Okay,
flexible in that way.
I see. So what are we saying here is when we do the impact test, it will not impact how the group was forming in the first place. And we'll just keep on that assumption. Mm-hmm. Okay, got you. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. In spirit of looking towards silver linings, I did want to bring up, so, we struggle with these debates about conduct and impact versus keeping our kind of more traditional, what we have with the 3 pivotal supplier with our impact modification years ago. When we were struggling through that, it was really driven more by a desire to have improvements from a bidding perspective, so we could submit price-based commitment costs as well as energy offers subject to mitigation. Every other market does that. It's kind of a thing that'd be great if CAISO also did. I mean, if you want to be, you want to be a best-in-class market. So it is a thing that the CAISO has struggled with, of how to improve your market design to be on a level playing field with the rest of the market designs on this effort. What was really difficult and fraught about that debate, conduct and impact versus keeping ours, is frankly, we have a sunk cost we have the dynamic competitive path assessment. So we're really going to scrap that and build a whole new design. So I think that's something we're going to need your feedback on from your side, kind of in future meetings, of if you're genuinely willing to go to a conduct and impact test. The other thing was we weren't talking about system market power concerns. So when we were thinking about, is it worth that time investment to move away from the 3 pivotal supplier test on the transmission constraints to a conduct and impact test, I think it lacked a full value of needing to test for system market power. Now that we're talking about it in the system market power lens, perhaps that net benefits changes, right? So now that you're really concerned about system market power, as well as I hope you're still concerned about giving the bidding flexibility on the commitment costs, perhaps it is something we need to think about. That would be a silver lining. Like, if we could improve this market to have the bidding flexibility on par with everyone else through going to a conduct and impact test, where you're testing the commitment and the energy offers and you're subjecting them all to mitigation, I mean, that's a huge silver lining, James. So like, if that's something that can be on the table, it would be good to pivot and talk about it in that perspective, because you're going to get a ton of value add from having that bidding flexibility. So even if there is over mitigation, through kind of moving to a conduct and impact test, we can tweak the thresholds and kind of refine it. The other thing to be mindful of, so your understanding of conduct and impact is the same as mine. It's done across the whole system. One of the other things is that a pivotal supplier test can be used in those, at least I believe SPP uses it to identify and differentiate what the thresholds are for conduct versus impact. So rather than talking about it as an all-in-one, maybe think more about it as grays, shades of grays instead of black and white. I mean, I think there's value of a conduct and impact test and moving away from what we currently do. That would just be one test though, right? And so that addresses some of the complexities. If you were to try to do a conduct and impact test plus the LMPM, I do think you'd get into some like runtime and complexity issues if we were really trying to keep both of these. But I wanted to bring into the conversation, like, commitment costs should be a part of this conversation because they are a part of the 3-part bid that drives these outcomes as well. And so ideally, we're talking about a framework that works for the 3-part bid in this scope as well. Thanks.
I appreciate that. I have a couple of things to respond to. The first is that the intention here is that we wouldn't need to, at least we think that we can meet the spirit of conduct and impact without throwing away the DCPA by simply adding the step in red, because it would essentially have the CAISO BA level test would have the same 3 steps that all the conduct and impact tests have, made potentially in different order, but they're all there. And so the concept being that you have to fail the structural test, you have to fail the conduct test, which is looking at your bid relative to competitive reference price, and you have to fail the impact test in order to be mitigated. And so we don't think we need to scrap everything that we've done and start over to meet the spirit of an impact test for BA level market power. The other thing is that before
you move on, can I respond real quick?
Yeah.
So
sure.
My concern is if you don't, so When you run a conduct and impact test, like a real conduct and impact test, where you identify the conduct thresholds, then and then you lower them and rerun to identify what the counterfactual, what that impact is on the prices to flag if mitigation should occur. That is actually pretty punitive. I mean, it's a very conservative test, and it also enforces transmission constraints. So when you run that test with enforced transmission constraints and you're looking at the price impacts, you actually are capturing local market power risks at the same time you're testing for system. So if you were to then also do the residual supply index approach for transmission constraints, I actually think it's duplicative and it would be overly punitive. Unless you do something else to change it. Yeah.
Nope.
Keep going.
Okay. Yeah, then, so the other thing I wanted to talk about related to scope. So the conversation about BA level market power way back when got brought into price formation because it's part of the scope of the EDAM to include BA level market power mitigation as an extension of the EIM to the EDAM. And then questions about whether or not the BA level process needed to be updated, to meet the growing market footprint were deferred to this initiative. And so this initiative scope is focused on improvements to BA level market power mitigation. Simply scope related to formation of default energy bids, whether or not to include commitment costs within that, whether or not they're worthy of attention in some other, proceeding are just not in scope for this initiative.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, so when CAISO was doing the market redesign and technology upgrade, and going through that design effort in the mid 2000s, when it brought forward its current market power mitigation and design to the board, CAISO one of the flaws with the design that the team had to talk through is that they didn't have a design for the commitment costs. And because even PJM, the other markets that use three pivotal supplier mitigate the full three-part bid. CAISO committed at the time, I think that was 2007, that they were going to address it as soon as possible. And we moved forward and there was a long line of initiatives trying to address it. CCW was the most recent. I mentioned that it tried to do an approximation of the LMPM for commitment costs that hasn't been implemented. This is now a conversation about mitigation design. And it would really be a shame not to address something that CAISO committed to in like 2007.
Yeah, I understand. And we can talk about not more internally, but the scope of this initiative is pretty well defined. It's been running for almost 2.5 years. And it's not to say that beneficial changes to the market design shouldn't be considered. I'm just saying that the scope of this initiative is well defined, and it is to talk about BA level market power and these types of tests. And just trying to make that clear.
Yeah, you're trying to manage my expectations, and I appreciate that. I think what would be really and I'm trying to provide very targeted feedback of, you are literally the only market that is FERC jurisdictional that doesn't apply a test to all parts of the bid. So I do think it's in scope. Whether you change the bidding rules, how you apply it to the three-part bid at least needs to be explained. And you should be honest that it's a flaw in your market. Like, it's a thing you're not addressing, whether or not you want to address it, and just be really open about it. But I do want everyone to know who's on the call, and it's been well documented. Every other market either does the structural test or they do a conduct and impact test, and they mitigate the entire three-part bid, and they allow the entire three-part bid to have price-based offers subject to mitigation. And so CAISO is the only one that doesn't allow that. And I just want everyone to know that, James, and just for you to be very open about the fact that you are or are not going to apply it consistently to the three-part bid. That's all.
Yeah, I appreciate the comments. I don't know if I really have anything else to say.
Just, I guess, replying, I would highlight, Kathleen, that we did field that, and that request to readdress this in the stakeholder catalog process. And so while James has indicated it's likely not to be part of this initiative, it's something that we are aware of and trying to see how it can be appropriately prioritized. Hope that helps.
Really helpful. You know, that's super helpful, and that's all the clarity I'm looking for. Thank you.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I've been unmuted, so I'm assuming it's my turn in queue, but if you need me to defer, I will.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, I know we're up against the 4 o'clock hour, so I'll keep this brief, but just a quick follow-up on the conversation you had with JK. I thought I understood, and now maybe I've confused myself. So when you get to the impact test piece of this, and let's say the LMPs are higher than the threshold when you're comparing the LMP between the market run with the mitigated and the market run with all the unmitigated bids. Are all the resources bids mitigated, or only the resources bids are mitigated where their individual LMP difference exceeded that threshold?
I think it will, well, I don't know the answer only because I've only had the concept here, and I think it might vary depending on the market that have actually implemented conduct and impact. So I think what we need to do is a little bit more investigative work on how, how granular they get. Because there's a trade-off between the more counterfactuals that you need to, add, the more difficult it would be to solve. But it does seem to make sense that if you have one market run where you are comparing the LMP deltas between the unmitigated group and the mitigated group, and only moving forward with mitigation for the uncompetitive locations that exceed the threshold, that seems like a reasonable thing to do. I just don't know for sure if that's how other markets have actually implemented it. So, but it sounds reasonable to me.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. And that's actually a perfect segue to my second comment. I would say, I think it is worthwhile to dig in a little bit more to see how all the other ISOs do this. Because I know here on this slide, you only show the impact aspect of this test. And in all the conversations and all the other ISOs that have the impact, it's a conduct and impact test. And there are some differences between their conduct and impact tests and what you have on the slide. And so I think it would be very useful to kind of do a deeper dive into how the other ISOs have structured their conduct and impact tests, because I think their conduct test might be an initial filter on which resources are then tested on the impact side of things. And then also it would help us understand how the other ISOs that have this conduct and impact test, how they handle testing for both system and local market power mitigation. So yeah, I guess I'll ask that maybe in the next iteration we get a little bit deeper into the other ISOs and look at how those are implemented. Thanks.
Yeah, I do have some information on the next slide about the actual impact test thresholds that are used in other markets, and that can help provide a nice baseline. I'll just add that my understanding of the conduct test is not different than what we're doing here, which is that my understanding of what the conduct test means is that they're evaluating the bids against the reference price, which is exactly what we do. And failing the conduct test means that there is reason to believe that, one, there is the potential, or failing the conduct test means that you have submitted offers that exceed the reference price by some threshold. And so in that case, it would be, I think some markets do order it where the conduct, they don't really look at the structural competitiveness, which is, I think, what Kathleen was bringing up, that they're just looking at the bids themselves and evaluating it against the reference price and flagging those as potentially uncompetitive. and then doing the rest of the test in some sort of different order. But I think the fundamental of the conduct test is really just looking at whether a bid exceeds a reference level. And we do that in the CAISO using the DEBs and the competitive LMP. Now, we don't have conduct test thresholds, meaning that if the bid is exceeding the reference price by some level, but we integrated within the DEBs themselves are, these sort of multipliers that sort of act as, these sort of thresholds. So I think in combination, again, my view is that all that would be needed to meet the spirit of a conduct and impact test is this additional step within the existing DCPA structure. And I'm open to the discussion. And so we can look at that, and I think it'll become more clear once we all investigate how it works in other markets, and maybe there are some differences and nuances that aren't represented well here. I only have one more slide, and okay, go ahead. Okay, that's fine.
Oh yeah, just I think that would be really, because I think there are some differences. I think their thresholds for the conduct, right? Yours is just, it's 1 cent above the DEB. You're going to be mitigated, whereas theirs has quite a bit of a higher threshold. So I think it is worthwhile. I think there are some differences. I do wonder if this is mixing and matching some of the structural test elements with the conduct and impact test. And I'm not saying that's not the way we should go. I'm just saying there are some differences, and I think we need to think through them and understand how they all interact to make sure that we get, to the best possible outcome. So thanks.
Yeah, fair enough. But I just will add that the conduct test thresholds, it also depends on how those markets are forming their default energy bids. Because if their default energy bids themselves may not all themselves include some sort of multipliers like the CAISO default energy bids do. And so therefore it would be duplicative potentially. And this is something we'd have to look at. If you have default energy bids that integrate these multipliers and have a conduct threshold, you would be duplicative. It would be duplicative relative to how it's done in the other ISOs. But I think this is all just good information that we need to dig more into. Let's go to the next slide to show these impact thresholds, and then that'll be a good place to conclude. So a couple of comments here. The 4 markets that have conduct and impact, this is my research looking at their tariffs and business practice manuals from what I can glean. It's very common to have this 200% or 100 megawatt threshold, which is used in ISO New England everywhere and is used in New York and MISO for what they call broad constrained areas in MISO, which are essentially, they'll use this higher impact threshold in areas where they are generally pretty competitive and don't have a lot of transmission constraints. So in MISO and New York ISO, when they've identified, frequently constrained areas, they do have a stricter impact test threshold, and they're different between MISO and New York. SPP has for the integrated market has a $25 threshold, and in the WISE, the Western Energy Imbalance Service, they have a $5 impact threshold, and that's something that was actually something that FERC required them to do. And as far as I understand, the SPP Market Monitor has recommended that the SPP increase those thresholds from the $5. But the WISE level would be the most apples to apples comparison here, because we're talking about BA level market power mitigation, and the WISE has BA level. The WISE is the only multi-BA market with which we can sort of try to make an apples to apples comparison. And so that might be the market that's most relevant if you're trying to get a sense about what a appropriate impact threshold might be. I'm gonna I think I have 2 more slides, and then I'll just pause at the end for questions if that's okay, so we can get through this material. Next slide, please. Just some things to consider. it may be valuable to have different impact thresholds depending on, for like MISO in New York, between constrained and unconstrained areas. You may want to have different thresholds during system emergencies where scarcity pricing is playing effect, peak versus on peak. Also, like SPP has a single $1 threshold, where some of the other markets have both $1 and a percentage threshold. So you would also want to consider that. And really the goal here is to try to design a threshold that's both effective and preventing market power abuse, but also efficient and allowing legitimate market operations to proceed unhindered. And that's sort of the overall arching philosophy of what we're trying to accomplish in these discussions. One more slide, I believe. This may be the last slide. Okay, and this slide we've sort of mentioned. There will be trade-offs as it relates to, the more, it will reduce the frequency of mitigation, which will decrease the type 1 errors or mitigating suppliers that don't actually have are not actually exercising market power, but it will increase potentially type 2 errors, which is not mitigating resource suppliers that do have the ability to exert market power. And there will be trade-offs in terms of the complexity of the implementation. But I think we've talked about that enough. Okay, let's pause for some concluding remarks.
James, this is Kathleen Colbert from Fishers. Just one last thing, back on slide 28. Thanks for getting the benchmarking started. Public service announcement that there is at least an old version of that research in CCW's issue paper and table 5. I want to flag that for you. I'd really like to see you update it and just confirm that there weren't any other changes relative to that, but that table is a really good resource and I would update it. If we go back on slide 28, I'm encouraging you to do that because there's actually more complexity to what you went through with us. And I think if you pull from that table and just reconfirm if anything has changed, maybe you could go over that again. There's a couple important things that I think do you mind going back to slide 28, please? Thank you. So ISO New England has 2 thresholds depending on whether or not it's considered a general or a constrained area. And so perhaps you could add that in and show that difference. The constrained area has lower thresholds. Pretty basic, but concept. MISO, I appreciate it. Looks like you've got both there, which is excellent. New York ISO also has 2, which it looks like we have here, so that's great. I didn't see any discussion of the uplift payment piece to the impact threshold though, so maybe double check that. On SPP has 3, depending on if it's frequently constrained area, driven by a local reliability issue commitment, or general. And the tariff sections are all cited in that table if you want to take a look at it. SPP also has an uplift payment component to there. So I think that's really an important policy item for the benchmarking, because whether or not you're only looking at potential changes in price impact versus uplift impact, that has its own policy debate discussion. And those are pretty important policy discussions that we would need to have.
Appreciate the additional references because this information was collected by my reading of the tariffs, and I'm glad to hear some of the work has been duplicative, and I can refer to some other places. But I hope it's at least helpful to get a general concept. And yeah, it does seem typical that the markets have different impact thresholds defined for constrained areas versus unconstrained areas, and I must have missed that for ISO New England and SPP, but this was the information I could find. So yeah, it'd be good to combine references there.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you doing this, and it's very, very useful. I agree with you. I think that these, It's the use of kind of identifying general versus more constrained and kind of how you might apply thresholds there. And then the uplift ones really I always found that like an interesting policy discussion because prices, and it really depends on whether or not you have concerns with those bids impacting the uplift payments just due to recent efforts. Uplift is kind of top of mind for me. So I think that was the other reason I was like, oh, I think I remember something. And just wanted to flag it for you. So thanks for doing this benchmarking.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, that concludes my portion. Brenda, go ahead and take us away.
Thank you, James. So for today's, just wrap up this call. Thanks everyone for your feedback. We'll try to get this recording posted as soon as we can. Also, we do have that document that we're trying to update with the schedule. And then we'll be announcing a notice for the upcoming meetings in December. But keep in mind, we do have a market performance and planning forum scheduled on December 12th. Already sent out a notice for that and agenda. And then we do have a few other meetings coming your way for other initiatives. So keep an eye out for the California ISO under calendar and meetings, and then you'll see a lot of the under meetings on there. And also the Stakeholder Center will be up to date with more overview meetings of our calendar, and also that high level timeline that we're providing every week for our current policy initiatives. But at this time, let's go ahead and close this call, send it back to Michelle. Thank you so much, everyone, and happy holidays if we don't meet again.
Thank you for joining today's call. Thank you for using event services. The call has ended and you may disconnect.